Chapter 23, Part 1 of The Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles ELLMS. Chapter 23, Part 1 of the West India Pirates. Containing accounts of their atrocities, manners of living, etc., and proceedings of the squadron under Commodore Porter in those seas, the victory and death of Lieutenant Allen, the interesting narrative of Captain Lincoln, etc. Those innumerable groups of islands, keys, and sandbanks, known as the West Indies, are peculiarly adapted from their locality and formation to be a favorite resort for pirates. Many of them are composed of coral rocks, on which a few cocoa trees raise their lofty heads. Where there is sufficient earth for vegetation between the interstices of the rocks, stunted brushwood grows. But a chief peculiarity of some of the islands, and which renders them suitable to those who frequent them as pirates, are the numerous caves with which the rocks are perforated. Some of them are above high water mark, but the majority with the sea water flowing in and out of them, in some cases merely rushing in at high water, filling deep pools, which are detached from each other when the tide recedes, in others with a sufficient depth of water to allow a large boat to float in. It is hardly necessary to observe how convenient the higher and dry caves are as receptacles for articles which are intended to be concealed, until an opportunity occurs to dispose of them. The Bahamas themselves are a singular group of isles, reefs, and quays, consisting of several hundred in number, and were the chief resort of pirates in old times, but now they are all rooted from them. They are low and not elevated, and are more than 600 miles in extent, cut up into numerous intricate passages and channels, full of sunken rocks and coral reefs. They afforded a sure retreat to desperadoes. Other islands are full of mountain fastnesses, where all pursuit can be eluded. Many of the low shores are skirted, and the islands covered by the mangrove, a singular tree, shooting fresh roots as it grows, which, when the tree is at its full age, may be found 6 or 8 feet from the ground, to which the shoots gradually tend in regular succession. The leaf is very thick and stiff, and about 8 inches long and 9 wide. The interval between the roots offers secure hiding places for those who are suddenly pursued. Another circumstance assists the pirates when pursued. As the islands belong to several different nations, when pursued from one island he can pass to that under the jurisdiction of another power, and as permission must be got by those in pursuit of him, from the authorities of the island to land and take him, he thus gains time to secrete himself. A tropical climate is suited to a roving life, and liquor as well as dissolute women being in great abundance, to gratify him during his hours of relaxation, makes this a congenial region for the lawless. The crews of pirate vessels in these areas are chiefly composed of Spaniards, Portuguese, French, mulattoes, negroes, and a few natives of other countries. The island of Cuba is the great nest of pirates at the present day, and at Havana piracy is as much tolerated as any other profession. As the piracies committed in these seas during a single year have amounted to more than 50, we shall give only a few accounts of the most interesting. In November, 1821, the brig Robiscanti, Captain Jackson, sailed from Havana on the morning of the 8th for Boston, and on the evening of the same day, about 4 miles from the Moro, was brought to by a piratical sloop containing about 30 men. A boat from her, with 10 men, came alongside, and soon after they got on board, commenced plundering. They took nearly all the clothing from the captain and mate, all the cooking utensils and spare rigging, unrove part of the running rigging, cut the small cable, broke the compasses, cut the mast coats to pieces, took from the captain his watch and 4 boxes cigars, and from the cargo 3 bales cochineal and 6 boxes cigars. They beat the mate unmercifully, and hung him up by the neck under the maintop. They also beat the captain severely, broke a large broadsword across his back, and ran a long knife through his thigh, so that he almost bled to death. Captain Jackson saw the sloop at Regla the day before. Captain Jackson informs us, and we have also been informed by other persons from the Havana, that this system of piracy is openly countenanced by some of the inhabitants of that place, who say that it is a retaliation on the Americans for interfering against the slave trade. About this time the ship Liverpool Packet, Ricker, of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was boarded off Cape San Antonio, Cuba, by two piratical schooners. Two barges containing 30 or 40 men robbed the vessel of everything movable, even of her flags, rigging, and a boat which happened to be afloat, having a boy in it, which belonged to the ship. They held a consultation whether they should murder the crew, as they had done before, or not; in the meantime taking the ship into anchoring ground. On bringing her to anchor, the crew saw a brig close alongside, burnt to the water's edge, and 3 dead bodies floating near her. The pirates said they had burnt the brig the day before, and murdered all the crew, and intended doing the same with them. They said, "Look at the turtles," meaning the dead bodies; "you will soon be the same." They said the vessel was a Baltimore brig, which they had robbed and burnt, and murdered the crew as before stated, of which they had little doubt. Captain Ricker was most shockingly bruised by them. The mate was hung till he was supposed to be dead, but came to, and is now alive. They told the captain that they belonged in Regla, and should kill them all to prevent discovery. In 1822 the United States had several cruisers among the West India Islands to keep the pirates in check. Much good was done, but still many vessels were robbed and destroyed, together with their crews. This year the brave Lieutenant Allen fell by the hand of pirates; and receiving intelligence at Matanzas that several vessels which had sailed from that port had been taken by pirates, and were then in the Bay of Lejuapo, he hastened to their assistance. He arrived just in time to save 5 sails of vessels which he found in possession of a gang of pirates, 300 strong, established in the Bay of Lejuapo, about 15 leagues east of this. He fell, pierced by 2 musket balls, in the van of a division of boats, attacking their principal vessel, a fine schooner of about 80 tons, with a long 18-pounder on a pivot, and 4 smaller guns, with the bloody flag nailed to the mast. Himself, Captain Freeman of Marines, and 12 men were in the boat, much in advance of his other boats, and even took possession of the schooner, after a desperate resistance, which nothing but a bravery almost too daring could have overcome. The pirates, all but one, escaped by taking to their boats and jumping overboard, before the Alligator's boat reached them. 2 other schooners escaped by the use of their oars, the wind being light. Captain Allen survived about 4 hours, during which his conversation evinced a composure and firmness of mind and correctness of feeling, as honorable to his character, and more consoling to his friends, than even the dauntless bravery he before exhibited. The surgeon of the Alligator, in a letter to a friend, says, "He continued giving orders and conversing with Mr. Dale and the rest of us until a few minutes before his death, with a degree of cheerfulness that was little to be expected from a man in his condition. He said he wished his relatives and his country to know that he had fought well, and added that he died in peace and good will towards all the world, and hoped for his reward in the next." Lieutenant Allen had but few equals in the service. He was ardently devoted to the interest of his country, was brave, intelligent, and accomplished in his profession. He displayed, living and dying, a magnanimity that sheds lustre on his relatives, his friends, and his country. About this time Captain Lincoln fell into the hands of the pirates, and as his treatment shows the peculiar habits and practices of these wretches, we insert the very interesting narrative of the captain. The schooner Exertion, Captain Lincoln, sailed from Boston, bound for Trinidad de Cuba, November 13th, 1821, with the following crew: Joshua Brackett, mate; David Warren, cook; and Thomas Young, Francis de Suze, and George Reed, seamen. The cargo consisted of flour, beef, pork, lard, butter, fish, beans, onions, potatoes, apples, hams, furniture, sugar box shooks, etc., invoiced at about $8,000. Nothing remarkable occurred during the passage, except much bad weather, until my capture, which was as follows: Monday, December 17th, 1821. Commenced with fine breezes from the eastward. At daybreak saw some of the islands northward of Cape Cruz, called Keys. Stood along northwest. Everything now seemed favorable for a happy termination of our voyage. At 3 o'clock P.M. saw a sail coming round one of the keys, into a channel called Boca de Cavallon by the chart, nearly in latitude 20 degrees 55 minutes north, longitude 79 degrees 55 minutes west. She made directly for us with all sails set, sweeps on both sides, the wind being light, and was soon near enough for us to discover about 40 men on her deck, armed with muskets, blunderbusses, cutlasses, long knives, dirks, etc., 2 cannonades, one a 12, the other a 6-pounder. She was a schooner, wearing the Patriot flag, blue, white, and blue, of the Republic of Mexico. I thought it not prudent to resist them should they be pirates, with a crew of 7 men and only 5 muskets. Accordingly ordered the arms and ammunition to be immediately stowed away in as secret a place as possible, and suffer her to speak us, hoping and believing that a Republican flag indicated both honor and friendship from those who wore it, and which we might expect even from Spaniards. But how great was my astonishment, when the schooner having approached very near us, hailed in English, and ordered me to heave my boat out immediately, and come on board of her with my papers. Accordingly my boat was hove out, but filled before I could get into her. I was then ordered to tack ship and lay by for the pirates' boat to board me, which was done by Bolidar, their first lieutenant, with 6 or 8 Spaniards, armed with as many of the before mentioned weapons as they could well sling about their bodies. They drove me into the boat, and 2 of them rowed me to their privateer, as they called their vessel, where I shook hands with their commander, Captain Jonea, a Spaniard, who before looking at my papers, ordered Bolidar, his lieutenant, to follow the Mexican in, back of the key they had left, which was done. At 6 o'clock P.M. the Exertion was anchored in 11 feet of water near this vessel, and an island which they called 12 League Key, called by the chart Key Largo, about 30 or 35 leagues from Trinidad. After this strange conduct they began examining my papers by a Scotchman who went by the name of Nicola, their sailing master. He spoke good English, had a countenance rather pleasing, although his beard and mustachios had a frightful appearance. His face, apparently full of anxiety, indicated something in my favour. He gave me my papers, saying, "Take good care of them, for I am afraid you have fallen into bad hands." The pirates' boat was then sent to the Exertion with more men and arms. A part of them left on board her, the rest returning with 3 of my crew to their vessel, viz. Thomas Young, Thomas Goodall, and George Reed. They treated them with something to drink, and offered them equal shares with themselves, and some money, if they would enlist, but they could not prevail on them. I then requested permission to go on board my vessel, which was granted, and further requested Nicola should go with me, but was refused by their captain, who vociferated in a harsh manner, "No, no, no," accompanied with a heavy stamp upon the deck. When I got on board I was invited below by Bolidar, where I found they had emptied the case of liquors, and broken a cheese to pieces and crumbled it on the table and cabin floor. The pirates, elated with their prize, as they called it, had drank so much as to make them desperately abusive. I was permitted to lie down in my berth, but reader, if you have ever been awakened by a gang of armed desperadoes, who have taken possession of your habitation in the midnight hour, you can imagine my feelings. Sleep was a stranger to me, and anxiety was my guest. Bolidar, however, pretended friendship, and flattered me with the prospect of being soon set at liberty. But I found him, as I suspected, a consummate hypocrite. Indeed, his very looks indicated it. He was a stout and well-built man, of a dark, swarthy complexion, with keen, ferocious eyes, huge whiskers, and beard under his chin and on his lips, 4 or 5 inches long. He was a Portuguese by birth, but had become a naturalized Frenchman. Had a wife, if not children, as I was told, in France, and was well known there as a commander of a first-rate privateer. His appearance was truly terrific. He could talk some English, and had a most lion-like voice. Tuesday, 18th. Early this morning the captain of the pirates came on board the Exertion, took a look at the cabin stores and cargo in the staterooms, and then ordered me back with him to his vessel, where he, with his crew, held a consultation for some time respecting the cargo. After which the interpreter, Nicola, told me that the captain had, or pretended to have, a commission under General Traspelascus, Commander-in-Chief of the Republic of Mexico, authorizing him to take all cargoes whatever of provisions bound to any royalist Spanish port, that my cargo being bound to an enemy's port must be condemned, but that the vessel should be given up, and be put into a fair channel for Trinidad, where I was bound. I requested him to examine the papers thoroughly, and perhaps he would be convinced to the contrary, and told him my cargo was all American property taken in at Boston, and consigned to an American gentleman, agent at Trinidad. But the captain would not take the trouble, but ordered both vessels under way immediately, and commenced beating up amongst the keys through most of the day, the wind being very light. They now sent their boats on board the Excursion for stores, and commenced plundering her of bread, butter, lard, onions, potatoes, fish, beans, etc., took up some sugar box shocks that were on deck, and found the barrels of apples, selected the best of them, and threw the rest overboard. They inquired for spirits, wine, cider, etc., and were told they had already taken all that was on board. But not satisfied, they proceeded to search the state rooms and forecastle, ripped up the floor of the latter and found some boxes of bottled cider, which they carried to their vessel, gave 3 cheers, in an exulting manner to me, and then began drinking it with such freedom, that a violent quarrel arose between officers and men, which came very near ending in bloodshed. I was accused of falsehood, for saying they had got all the liquors that were on board, and I thought they had. The truth was, I never had any bill of lading of the cider, and consequently had no recollection of its being on board, yet it served them as an excuse for being insolent. In the evening peace was restored, and they sung songs. I was suffered to go below for the night, and they placed a guard over me, stationed at the companion way. Wednesday, 19th, commenced with moderate easterly winds, beating towards the northeast, the pirates' boats frequently going on board the Exertion for potatoes, fish, beans, butter, etc., which were used with great waste and extravagance. They gave me food and drink, but of bad quality, more particularly the victuals, which were wretchedly cooked. The place assigned me to eat was covered with dirt and vermin. It appeared that their great object was to hurt my feelings with threats and observations, and to make my situation as unpleasant as circumstances would admit. We came to anchor near a key, called by them Brigantine, where myself and mate were permitted to go on shore, but were guarded by several armed pirates. I soon returned to the Mexican, and my mate to the Exertion, with George Reed, one of my crew, the other 2 being kept on board the Mexican. In the course of this day I had considerable conversation with Nickola, who appeared well disposed towards me. He lamented most deeply his own situation, for he was one of those men, whose early good impressions were not entirely effaced, although confederated with guilt. He told me, those who had taken me were no better than pirates, and their end would be the halter. But, he added with peculiar emotion, I will never be hung as a pirate, showing me a bottle of laudanum which he had found in my medicine chest, saying, if we are taken, that shall cheat the hangman, before we are condemned. I endeavoured to get it from him, but did not succeed. I then asked him how he came to be in such company, as he appeared to be dissatisfied. He stated that he was at New Orleans last summer, out of employment, and became acquainted with one Captain Auguste Orgamar, a Frenchman, who had bought a small schooner of about 15 tons, and was going down to the Bay of Mexico to get a commission under General Traspelascus, in order to go a privateering under the patriot flag. Captain Orgamar made him liberal offers respecting shares, and promised him a sailing master's berth, which he accepted, and embarked on board the schooner, without sufficiently reflecting on the danger of such an undertaking. Soon after, they sailed from Mexico, where they got a commission, and the vessel was called Mexican. They made up a complement of 20 men, and after rendering the general some little service in transporting his troops to a place called, proceeded on a cruise, took some small prizes off Campeachy, afterwards came on the south coast of Cuba, where they took other small prizes, and the one which we were now on board of. By this time the crew were increased to about 40, nearly one half Spaniards, the others Frenchmen and Portuguese. Several of them had sailed out of ports in the United States with American protections, but I confidently believe none are natives, especially of the northern states. I was careful in examining the men, being desirous of knowing if any of my countrymen were among this wretched crew, but am satisfied there were none, and my Scotch friend concurred in the opinion. And now, with a new vessel, which was the prize of these plunderers, they sailed up Manganil Bay. Previously, however, they fell in with an American schooner, from which they bought 4 barrels of beef, and paid in tobacco. At the bay was an English brig belonging to Jamaica, owned by Mr. John Loudon of that place. On board of this vessel the Spanish part of the crew commenced their depredations as pirates, although Captain Orgamar and Nicolai protested against it, and refused any participation. But they persisted, and like so many ferocious bloodhounds, boarded the brig, plundered the cabin, stores, furniture, captain's trunks, etc., took a hogshead of rum, 1 12-pound carronade, some rigging and sails. One of them plundered the chest of a sailor, who made some resistance, so that the Spaniard took his cutlass, and beat and wounded him without mercy. Nicholai asked him why he did it. The fellow answered, I will let you know, and took up the cook's axe and gave him a cut on the head, which nearly deprived him of life. Then they ordered Captain Orgamar to leave his vessel, allowing him his trunk, and turned him ashore, to seek for himself. Nicholai begged them to dismiss him with his captain, but no, no, was the answer, for they had no complete navigator but him. After Captain Orgamar was gone, they put in his stead the present brave, or as I shall call him cowardly, Captain Jania, who headed them in plundering the before mentioned brig, and made Bolidar their first lieutenant, and then proceeded down among those keys or islands where I was captured. This is the amount of what my friend Nicola told me of their history. Saturday, 22nd. Both vessels under way standing to the eastward. They ran the Exertion aground on a bar, but after throwing overboard most of her deck load of shooks, she floated off. A pilot was sent to her, and she was run into a narrow creek between two keys, where they moored her head and stern alongside of the mangrove trees, set down her yards and topmasts, and covered her mastheads and shrouds with bushes to prevent her being seen by vessels which might pass that way. I was then suffered to go on board my own vessel, and found her in a very filthy condition, sails torn, rigging cut to pieces, and everything in the cabin in waste and confusion. The swarms of mosquitoes and sandflies made it impossible to get any sleep or rest. The pirates' large boat was armed and manned under Bolidar, and sent off with letters to a merchant, as they called him, by the name of Dominico, residing in a town called Principe, on the main island of Cuba. I was told by one of them, who could speak English, that Principe was a very large and populous town, situated at the head of St. Maria, which was about 20 miles northeast from where we lay, and the keys lying around us were called Cotton Keys. The captain pressed into his service Francis de Sous, one of my crew, saying that he was one of his countrymen. Francis was very reluctant in going, and said to me with tears in his eyes, I shall do nothing but what I am obliged to do, and will not aid in the least to hurt you or the vessel. I am very sorry to leave you. He was immediately put on duty, and Thomas Goodall sent back to the Exertion. Sunday, 23rd. Early this morning a large number of the pirates came on board of the Exertion, threw out the long boat, broke open the hatches, and took out considerable of the cargo, in search of rum, gin, etc., still telling me, I had some and they would find it, uttering the most awful profaneness. In the afternoon their boat returned with a pirogue, having on board the captain, his first lieutenant, and 7 men of a patriot or piratical vessel that was chased ashore at Cape Cruz by a Spanish armed brig. These 7 men made their escape in said boat, and after 4 days, found our pirates and joined them, the remainder of the crew being killed or taken prisoners. Monday, 24th. Their boat was manned, and sent to the before mentioned town. I was informed by a line from Nicola, that the pirates had a man on board, a native of Principe, who, in the garb of a sailor, was a partner with Dominico, but I could not get sight of him. This lets us a little into the plans by which this atrocious system of piracy has been carried on. Merchants having partners on board of these pirates. Thus pirates at sea and robbers on land are associated to destroy the peaceful trader. The willingness exhibited by the 7 above mentioned men to join our gang of pirates seems to look like a general understanding among them, and from their being merchants on shore so base as to encourage the plunder and vend the goods, I am persuaded there has been a systematic confederacy on the part of these unprincipled desperadoes, under cover of the patriot flag, and those on land are no better than those on the sea. If the governments to whom they belong know of the atrocities committed, and I have but little doubt they do, they deserve the execration of all mankind. Thursday, 27th. A gang of the pirates came and stripped our masts of the green bushes, saying she appeared more like a sail than trees, took 1 barrel of bread and 1 of potatoes, using about 1 of each every day. I understood they were waiting for boats to take the cargo, for the principal merchant had gone to Trinidad. Sunday, 30th. The beginning of trouble. This day, which peculiarly reminds Christians of the high duties of compassion and benevolence, was never observed by these pirates. This, of course, we might expect, as they did not often know when the day came, and if they knew it, it was spent in gambling. The old saying among seamen, "No Sunday off soundings," was not thought of, and even this poor plea was not theirs, for they were on soundings and often at anchor. Early this morning the merchant, as they called him, came with a large boat for the cargo. I was immediately ordered into the boat with my crew, not allowed any breakfast, and carried about 3 miles to a small island out of sight of the Exertion, and left there by the side of a little pond of thick muddy water, which proved to be very brackish, with nothing to eat but a few biscuits. One of the boat's men told us the merchant was afraid of being recognized, and when he had gone the boat would return for us. But we had great reason to apprehend they would deceive us, and therefore passed the day in the utmost anxiety. At night, however, the boats came and took us again on board the Exertion, when to our surprise and astonishment we found they had broken open the trunks and chests, and taken all our wearing apparel, not even leaving a shirt or pair of pantaloons, nor sparing a small miniature of my wife which was in my trunk. The little money I and my mate had, with some belonging to the owners, my mate had previously distributed about the cabin in 3 or 4 parcels, while I was on board the pirate, for we dare not keep it about us. One parcel in a butter pot they did not discover. Amidst the hurry with which I was obliged to go to the before mentioned island, I fortunately snatched my vessel's papers, and hid them in my bosom, which the reader will find was a happy circumstance for me. My writing desk, with papers, accounts, etc., all Mr. Lord's letters, the gentleman to whom my cargo was consigned, and several others were taken and maliciously destroyed. My medicine chest, which I so much wanted, was kept for their own use. What their motive could be to take my papers I could not imagine, except they had hopes of finding bills of lading for some Spaniards to clear them from piracy. Mr. Bracket had some notes and papers of consequence to him, which shared the same fate. My quadrant, charts, books, and bedding were not yet taken, but I found it impossible to hide them, and they were soon gone from my sight. Tuesday, January 1st, 1822. A sad New Year's Day to me. Before breakfast orders came for me to cut down the Exertion's railing and bulwarks on one side, for their vessel to heave out by and clean her bottom. On my hesitating a little they observed with anger, "Very well, Captain, suppose you no do it quick, we do it for you." Directly afterwards another boat full of armed men came alongside. They jumped on deck with swords drawn, and ordered all of us into her immediately. I stepped below in hopes of getting something which would be of service to us, but the captain hallooed, "Go into the boat directly, or I will fire upon you." Thus compelled to obey, we were carried, together with 4 Spanish prisoners, to a small, low island or key of sand in the shape of a half moon, and partly covered with mangrove trees, which was about 1 mile from and in sight of my vessel. There they left 9 of us, with a little bread, flour, fish, lard, a little coffee, and molasses, 2 or 3 kegs of water, which was brackish, an old sail for a covering, and a pot and some other articles no way fit to cook in. Leaving us these, which were much less than they appear in enumeration, they pushed off, saying, "We will come to see you in a day or 2. Selecting the best place, we spread the old sail for an awning, but no place was free from flies, mosquitoes, snakes, the venomous skinned scorpion, and the more venomous centipede. Sometimes they were found crawling inside of our pantaloons, but fortunately no injury was received. This afternoon the pirates hove their vessel out by the Exertion and cleaned one side, using her paints, oil, etc. for that purpose. To see my vessel in that situation, and to think of our prospects, was a source of the deepest distress. At night we retired to our tent, but having nothing but the cold damp ground for a bed, and the heavy dew of night penetrating the old canvas, the situation of the island being 50 miles from the usual track of friendly vessels, and 135 from Trinidad, seeing my owner's property so unjustly and wantonly destroyed, considering my condition, the hands at whose mercy I was, and deprived of all hopes, rendered sleep or rest a stranger to me. Friday, 4th. Commenced with light winds and hot sun. Saw a boat coming from the Exertion, apparently loaded. She passed between 2 small keys to northward, supposed to be bound for Cuba. At sunset a boat came and inquired if we wanted anything, but instead of adding to our provisions, took away our molasses, and pushed off. We found one of the Exertion's water casks, and several pieces of plank, which we carefully laid up, in hopes of getting enough to make a raft. Saturday, 5th. Pirates again in sight, coming from the eastward. They beat up alongside their prize, and commenced loading. In the afternoon, Nickola came to us, bringing with him 2 more prisoners, which they had taken in a small boat coming from Trinidad to Mangonil, one a Frenchman, the other a Scotchman, with 2 Spaniards, who remained on board the pirate, and who afterwards joined them. One a Frenchman, the other a Scotchman. The back of one of these poor fellows was extremely sore, having just suffered a cruel beating from Bolidar, with the broadside of a cutlass. It appeared that when the officer asked him where their money was and how much, he answered, he was not certain, but believed they had only 2 ounces of gold. Bolidar furiously swore he said 10, and not finding any more, gave him the beating. Nickola now related to me a singular fact, which was, that the Spanish part of the crew were determined to shoot him, that they tied him to the mast, and a man was appointed for the purpose; but Lyon, a Frenchman, his particular friend, stepped up and told them, if they shot him they must shoot several more. Some of the Spaniards sided with him, and he was released. Nickola told me the reason for such treatment was, that he continually objected to their conduct towards me, and their opinion if he should escape they would be discovered, as he declared he would take no prize money. While with us he gave me a letter written in great haste, which contained some particulars respecting the cargo, as follows: January 4th, 1822. Sir, we arrived here this morning, and before we came to anchor, had 5 canoes alongside ready to take your cargo, part of which we had in, and as I heard you express a wish to know what they took out of her, to this moment, you may depend upon this account of Jemison for quality and quantity. If I have the same opportunity, you will have an account of the whole. The villain who bought your cargo is from the town of Principe. His name is Dominico. As to that it is all that I can learn. They have taken your charts aboard the schooner Mexican, and I suppose mean to keep them, as the other captain has agreed to act the same infamous part in the tragedy of his life. Your clothes are here on board, but do not let me flatter you that you will get them back. It may be so, and it may not. Perhaps in your old age, when you recline with ease in a corner of your cottage, you will have the goodness to drop a tear of pleasure to the memory of him, whose highest ambition should have been to subscribe himself, though devoted to the gallows, your friend. Excuse haste. Nickola Monaker. Saturday, 6th. The pirates were under way at sunrise, with a full load of the Exertion's cargo, going to Principe again to sell a second freight, which was done readily for cash. I afterwards heard that the flour only fetched $5 per barrel, when it was worth at Trinidad 13, so that the villain who bought my cargo at Principe made very large profits by it. Tuesday, 8th. Early this morning the pirates in sight again, with foretopsail and topgallant sail set, beat up alongside of the Exertion, and commenced loading, having, as I suppose, sold and discharged her last freight among some of the inhabitants of Cuba. They appeared to load in great haste, and the song, O-E-O, which echoed from one vessel to the other, was distinctly heard by us. How wounding was this to me! How different was this sound from what it would have been, had I been permitted to pass unmolested by these lawless plunderers, and been favoured with a safe arrival at the port of my destination, where my cargo would have found an excellent sale. Then would the O-E-O, on its discharging, have been a delightful sound to me. In the afternoon she sailed with the Perot in tow, both with a full load, having chairs, which was part of the cargo, slung at her quarters. Monday, 14th. They again hove in sight, and beat up as usual alongside their prize. While passing our solitary island, they laughed at our misery, which was almost insupportable, looking upon us as though we had committed some heinous crime, and they had not sufficiently punished us. They hallooed to us, crying out, "Captain, Captain," accompanied with obscene motions and words, with which I shall not blacken these pages. Yet I heard no check upon such conduct, nor could I expect it among such a gang, who have no idea of subordination on board, except when in chase of vessels, and even then but very little. My resentment was excited at such a malicious outrage, and I felt a disposition to revenge myself, should fortune ever favour me with an opportunity. It was beyond human nature not to feel and express some indignation at such treatment. Soon after, Bolidar, with 5 men, well armed, came to us, he having a blunderbuss, cutlass, a long knife, and a pair of pistols. But for what purpose did he come? He took me by the hand, saying, "Captain, me speak with you, walk this way." I obeyed, and when at some distance from my fellow prisoners, his men following, he said, "The captain send me for your wash." I pretended not to understand what he meant, and replied, "I have no clothes, nor any soap to wash with. You have taken them all." For I had kept my watch about me, hoping they would not discover it. He demanded it again as before, and was answered, "I have nothing to wash." This raised his anger, and lifting his blunderbuss, he roared out, "What the devil you call him that make clock? Give it me." I considered it imprudent to contend any longer, and submitted to his unlawful demand. As he was going off, he gave me a small bundle, in which was a pair of linen drawers, sent to me by Nickola, and also the Reverend Mr. Brooks' family prayer book. This gave me great satisfaction. Soon after he returned with his captain, who had one arm slung up, yet with as many implements of war as his diminutive wicked self could conveniently carry. He told me, through an interpreter who was his prisoner, that on his cruise he had fallen in with 2 Spanish privateers, and beat them off, but had 3 of his men killed, and himself wounded in the arm. Bolidar turned to me and said, "It is a damn lie," which words proved to be correct, for his arm was not wounded, and when I saw him again, which was soon afterwards, he had forgotten to sling it up. He further told me, "After tomorrow you shall go with your vessel, and we will accompany you towards Trinidad." This gave me some new hopes, and why I could not tell. They then left us without rendering any assistance. This night we got some rest. Tuesday, 15th. The words, "go after tomorrow," were used among our Spanish fellow prisoners, as though the happy tomorrow would never come. In what manner it came will soon be noticed. Friday, 18th, commenced with brighter prospects of liberty than ever. The pirates were employed in setting up our devoted schooner's shrouds, stays, etc. My condition now reminded me of the hungry man, chained in one corner of a room, while at another part was a table loaded with delicious food and fruits, the smell and sight of which he was continually to experience. But alas, his chains were never to be loosed that he might go and partake. At almost the same moment they were thus employed, the axe was applied with the greatest dexterity to both her masts, and I saw them fall over the side. Here fell my hopes. I looked at my condition, and then thought of home. Our Spanish fellow prisoners were so disappointed and alarmed that they recommended hiding ourselves, if possible, among the mangrove trees, believing, as they said, we should now certainly be put to death, or, what was worse, compelled to serve on board the Mexican as pirates. Little else, it is true, seemed left for us. However, we kept a bright look out for them during the day, and at night an anchor watch, as we called it, determined if we discovered their boats coming toward us, to adopt the plan of hiding, although starvation stared us in the face, yet preferred that to instant death. This night was passed in sufficient anxiety. I took the first watch. Saturday, 19th. The pirates' largest boat came for us, it being daylight, and supposing they could see us, determined to stand our ground and wait the result. They ordered us all into the boat, but left everything else. They rowed towards Exertion. I noticed a dejection of spirits in one of the pirates, and inquired of him where they were going to carry us. He shook his head and replied, "I do not know." I now had some hopes of visiting my vessel again, but the pirates made sail, ran down, took us in tow, and stood out of the harbour. Bolidar afterwards took me, my mate, and 2 of my men on board and gave us some coffee. On examination I found they had several additional light sails, made of the Exertions. Almost every man a pair of canvas trousers, and my colours cut up and made into belts to carry their money about them. My jolly boat was on deck, and I was informed all my rigging was disposed of. Several of the pirates had on some of my clothes, and the captain one of my best shirts, a cleaner one, than I had ever seen him have on before. He kept a good distance from me, and forbid my friend Nickola's speaking to me. I saw from the companion way in the captain's cabin my quadrant, spy glass, and other things which belonged to us, and observed by the compass that the course steered was about west by south, distance nearly 20 miles, which brought them up with a cluster of islands called by some Cayman Keys. Here they anchored and caught some fish, one of which was named guardfish, of which we had a taste. I observed that my friend Mr. Bracket was somewhat dejected, and asked him in a low voice what his opinion was with respects to our fate. He answered, "I cannot tell you, but it appears to me the worst is to come. I told him that I hoped not, but thought they would give us our small boat and liberate the prisoners. But mercy even in this shape was not left for us. Soon after, saw the captain and officers whispering for some time in private conference. When over, their boat was manned under the command of Bolidar, and went to one of those islands or keys before mentioned. On their return, another conference took place. Whether it was a jury upon our lives we could not tell. I did not think conscience could be entirely extinguished in the human breast, or that men could become fiends. In the afternoon, while we knew not the doom which had been fixed for us, the captain was engaged with several of his men in gambling, in hopes to get back some of the $500, they said, he lost but a few nights before, which had made him unusually fractious. A little before sunset he ordered all the prisoners into the large boat, with a supply of provisions and water, and to be put on shore. While we were getting into her, one of my fellow prisoners, a Spaniard, attempted with tears in his eyes to speak to the captain, but was refused with the answer, "I'll have nothing to say to any prisoner. Go into the boat." In the meantime Nickola said to me, "My friend, I will give you your book, being Mr. Coleman's sermons. It is the only thing of yours that is in my possession. I dare not attempt anything more." But the captain forbid his giving it to me, and I stepped into the boat. At that moment Nickola said in a low voice, "Never mind, I may see you again before I die." The small boat was well armed and manned, and both set off together for the island, where they had agreed to leave us to perish. The scene to us was a funeral scene. There were no arms in the prisoners' boat, and of course all attempts to relieve ourselves would have been throwing our lives away, as Bolidar was near us, well armed. We were rowed about 2 miles northeasterly from the pirates, to a small low island, lonely and desolate. We arrived about sunset, and for the support of us 11 prisoners, they only left a 10-gallon keg of water, and perhaps a few quarts, in another small vessel, which was very poor, part of a barrel of flour, a small keg of lard, 1 ham and some salt fish, a small kettle and an old broken pot, an old sail for a covering, and a small mattress and blanket, which was thrown out as the boats hastened away. One of the prisoners happened to have a little coffee in his pocket, and these comprehended all our means of sustaining life, and for what length of time we knew not. We now felt the need of water, and our supply was comparatively nothing. A man may live nearly twice as long without food as without water. Look at us now, my friends, left benighted on a little spot of sand in the midst of the ocean, far from the usual track of vessels, and every appearance of a violent thunder tempest, and a boisterous night. Judge of my feelings and the circumstances which our band of sufferers now witnessed. Perhaps you can, and have pitied us. I assure you, we were very wretched, and to paint the scene is not within my power. When the boats were moving from the shore, on recovering myself a little, I asked Bolidar if he was going to leave us so. He answered, "No, only 2 days. We go for water and wood, then come back, take you." I requested him to give us bread and other stores, for they had plenty in the boat, and at least 100 barrels of flour in the Mexican. "No, no, suppose tomorrow morning me come, me give you bread," and hurried off to the vessel. This was the last time I saw him. We then turned our attention upon finding a spot most convenient for our comfort, and soon discovered a little roof supported by stakes driven into the sand. It was thatched with leaves of the cocoa nut tree, considerable part of which was torn or blown off. After spreading the old sail over this roof, we placed our little stock of provisions under it. Soon after came on a heavy shower of rain, which penetrated the canvas, and made it nearly as uncomfortable inside as it would have been out. We were not prepared to catch water, having nothing to put it in. Our next object was to get fire, and after gathering some of the driest fuel to be found, and having a small piece of cotton wick yarn, with flint and steel we kindled a fire, which was never afterwards suffered to be extinguished. The night was very dark, but we found a piece of old rope, which when well lighted served for a candle. On examining the ground under the roof, we found perhaps thousands of creeping insects, scorpions, lizards, crickets, etc. After scraping them out as well as we could, the most of us having nothing but the damp earth for a bed, laid ourselves down in hopes of some rest, but it being so wet, gave many of us severe colds, and one of the Spaniards was quite sick for several days. Sunday, 20th. As soon as daylight came on, we proceeded to take a view of our little island, and found it to measure only 1 acre of coarse white sand, about 2 feet and in some spots perhaps 3 feet above the surface of the ocean. On the highest part were growing some bushes and small mangroves, the dry part of which was our fuel, and the wild castor oil beans. We were greatly disappointed in not finding the latter suitable food. Likewise some of the prickly pear bushes, which gave us only a few pears about the size of our small button pear. The outside has thorns, which if applied to the fingers or lips, will remain there, and cause a severe smarting similar to the nettle. The inside a spongy substance, full of juice and seeds, which are red and a little tartish. Had they been there in abundance, we should not have suffered so much for water; but alas, even this substitute was not for us. On the northerly side of the island was a hollow, where the tide penetrated the sand, leaving stagnant water. We presumed in hurricanes the island was nearly overflowed. According to the best calculations I could make, we were about 35 miles from any part of Cuba, 100 from Trinidad, and 40 from the usual track of American vessels or others which might pass that way. No vessel of any considerable size can safely pass among these keys, or Queen's Gardens as the Spaniards call them, being a large number extending from Cape Cruz to Trinidad, 150 miles distance, and many more than the charts have laid down, most of them very low and some covered at high water, which makes it very dangerous for navigators without a skilful pilot. After taking this view of our condition, which was very gloomy, we began to suspect we were left on this desolate island by those merciless plunderers to perish. Of this I am now fully convinced. Still we looked anxiously for the pirates' boat to come according to the promise, with more water and provisions, but looked in vain. We saw them soon get under way with all sail set and run directly from us until out of our sight, and we never saw them again. One may partially imagine our feelings, but they cannot be put into words. Before they were entirely out of sight of us, we raised the white blanket upon a pole, waving it in the air, in hopes that at 2 miles distance they would see it and be moved to pity. But pity in such monsters was not to be found. It was not their interest to save us from the lingering death, which we now saw before us. We tried to compose ourselves, trusting to God, who had witnessed our sufferings, would yet make use of some one, as the instrument of his mercy towards us. Our next care now was to try for water. We dug several holes in the sand and found it, but quite too salt for use. The tide penetrates probably through the island. We now came on short allowances for water. Having no means of securing what we had by lock and key, some one in the night would slyly drink, and it was soon gone. The next was to bake some bread, which we did by mixing flour with salt water and frying it in lard, allowing ourselves 8 quite small pancakes to begin with. The ham was reserved for some more important occasion, and the salt fish was lost for want of fresh water. The remainder of this day was passed in the most serious conversation and reflection. At night I read prayers from the prayer book, before mentioned, which I most carefully concealed while last on board the pirates. This plan was pursued morning and evening during our stay there, then retired for rest and sleep, but realized little of either. End of chapter 23, part 1. Chapter 23, Part 2, of the Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Pirate's Own Book, by Charles ELLMS. Chapter 23, Part 2, of the West India Pirates. Monday, 21st. In the morning we walked round the beach, in expectation of finding something useful. On our way we picked up a paddle about 3 feet long, very similar to the Indian canoe paddle, except the handle, which was like that of a shovel, the top part being split off. We laid it by for the present. We likewise found some conchs, and roasted them. They were pretty good shellfish, though rather tough. We discovered at low water a bar or spit of sand extending northeasterly from us, about 3 miles distant, to a cluster of keys, which were covered with mangrove trees, perhaps as high as our quince tree. My friend Mr. Brackett and George attempted to wade across, being at that time of tide only up to their armpits, but were pursued by a shark, and returned without success. The tide rises about 4 feet. Tuesday, 22d. We found several pieces of the palmetto or cabbage tree, and some pieces of boards, put them together in the form of a raft, and endeavored to cross, but that proved ineffectual. Being disappointed, we sat down to reflect upon other means of relief, intending to do all in our power for safety while our strength continued. While sitting here, the sun was so powerful and oppressive, reflecting its rays upon the sea, which was then calm, and the white sand which dazzled the eye was so painful, that we retired under the awning. There the mosquitoes and flies were so numerous, that good rest could not be found. We were, however, a little cheered, when, in scraping out the top of the ground to clear out, I may say, thousands of crickets and bugs, we found a hatchet, which was to us peculiarly serviceable. At night the strong northeasterly wind, which prevails there at all seasons, was so cold as to make it equally uncomfortable with the day. Thus, day after day, our sufferings and apprehensions multiplying, we were very generally alarmed. Thursday, 24th. This morning, after taking a little coffee, made of the water which we thought least salt, and 2 or 3 of the little cakes, we felt somewhat refreshed, and concluded to make another visit to those keys, in hopes of finding something more, which might make a raft for us to escape the pirates, and avoid perishing by thirst. Accordingly 7 of us set off, waded across the bar, and searched all the keys thereabouts. On one we found a number of sugar box shooks, 2 lashing plank, and some pieces of old spars, which were a part of the Exertion's deck load, that was thrown overboard when she grounded on the bar, spoken of in the first part of the narrative. It seems they had drifted 15 miles, and had accidentally lodged on these very keys within our reach. Had the pirates known this, they would undoubtedly have placed us in another direction. They no doubt thought that they could not place us on a worse place. The wind at this time was blowing so strong on shore as to prevent rafting our stuff round to our island, and we were obliged to hull it upon the beach for the present, then dug for water in the highest place, but found it as salt as ever, and then returned to our habitation. But hunger and thirst began to prey upon us, and our comforts were as few as our hopes. Friday, 25th. Again passed over to those keys to windward in order to raft our stuff to our island, it being most convenient for building. But the surf on the beach was so very rough, that we were again compelled to postpone it. Our courage, however, did not fail where there was the slightest hopes of life. Returning without it, we found on our way an old top timber of some vessel. It had several spikes on it, which we afterwards found very serviceable. In the hollow of an old tree we found 2 garnas of small size, one male, the other female. Only one was caught. After taking off the skin, we judged it weighed 1.5 pounds. With some flour and lard, the only things we had except salt water, it made us a fine little mess. We thought it a rare dish, though a small one for 11 half-starved persons. At the same time a small vessel hove in sight. We made a signal to her with the blanket tied to a pole, and placed it on the highest tree. Some took off their white clothes, and waved them in the air, hoping they would come to us. Should they be pirates, they could do no more than kill us, and perhaps would give us some water, for which we began to suffer most excessively, but, notwithstanding all our efforts, she took no notice of us. Saturday, 26th. This day commenced with a moderate weather and smooth sea. At low tide found some cockles, boiled and ate them, but they were very painful to the stomach. David Warren had a fit of strangling, with swelling of the bowels, but soon recovered and said, something like salt rose in his throat and choked him. Most of us then set off for the keys, where the plank and shooks were put together in a raft, which we with pieces of boards paddled over to our island. When we consulted the best plan, either to build a raft large enough for us all to go on, or a boat. But the shooks having 3 or 4 nails in each, and having a piece of large reed or bamboo previously found, of which we made pins, we concluded to make a boat. Sunday, 27. Commenced our labor, for which I know we need offer no apology. We took the 2 planks, which were about 14 feet long and 2½ wide, and fixed them together for the bottom of the boat. Then the moulds made of palmetto bark, cut timber and knees from mangrove trees, which spread so much as to make the boat 4 feet wide at the top, placed them exactly the distance apart of an Havana sugar box. Her stern was square and the bows tapered to a peak, making her form resemble a flat iron. We proceeded thus far and returned to rest for the night, but Mr. Brackett was too unwell to get much sleep. Monday, 28. Went on with the work as fast as possible. Some of the Spaniards had long knives about them, which proved very useful in fitting timbers, and a gimblet of mine, accidentally found on board the pirate, enabled us to use the wooden pins. And now our spirits began to revive, though water was continually in our minds. We now feared the pirates might possibly come, find out our plan, and put us to death, although before we had wished to see them, being so much in want of water. Our labour was extremely burdensome, and the Spaniards considerably peevish, but they would often say to me, "Never mind, Captain, by and by, Americana or Spanyola catch them, me go and see 'em hung." We quitted work for the day, cooked some cakes, but found it necessary to reduce the quantity again, however small before. We found some herbs on a windward key, which the Spaniards called Spanish tea. This, when well boiled, we found somewhat palatable, although the water was very salt. This herb resembles pennyroyal in look and taste, though not so pungent. In the evening, when we were setting round the fire to keep off the mosquitoes, I observed David Warren's eyes shone like glass. The mate said to him, "David, I think you will die before morning. I think you are struck with death now." I thought so too, and told him, I thought it most likely we should all die here soon, but as some one of us might survive to carry the tidings to our friends, if you have any thing to say respecting your family, now is the time. He then said, "I have a mother in Saco where I belong. She is a second time a widow. To morrow, if you can spare a scrap of paper and pencil, I will write something." But no tomorrow came to him. In the course of the night he had another spell of strangling, and soon after expired, without much pain and without a groan. He was about 26 years old. How solemn was this scene to us! Here we beheld the ravages of death commenced upon us. More than one of us considered death a happy release. For myself, I thought of my wife and children, and wished to live if God should so order it, though extreme thirst, hunger, and exhaustion had well nigh prostrated my fondest hopes. Tuesday, 29th. Part of us recommenced labour on the boat, while myself and Mr. Brackett went and selected the highest clear spot of sand on the northern side of the island, where we dug Warren's grave, and boxed it up with shooks, thinking it would be the most suitable spot for the rest of us, whose turn would come next, we knew not. At about 10 o'clock a.m. conveyed the corpse to the grave, followed by us survivors, a scene whose awful solemnity can never be painted. We stood around the grave, and there I read the funeral prayer from the Reverend Mr. Brooks's family prayer book, and committed the body to the earth, covered it with some pieces of board and sand, and returned to our labour. One of the Spaniards, an old man, named Manuel, who was partial to me, and I to him, made a cross and placed it at the head of the grave, saying, "Jesus Christ hath him now." Although I did not believe in any mysterious influence of this cross, yet I was perfectly willing it should stand there. The middle part of the day being very warm, our mouths parched with thirst, and our spirits so depressed, that we made but little progress during the remainder of this day, but in the evening were employed in picking oakum out of the bolt rope taken from the old sail. Wednesday, 30th. Returned to labour on the boat with as much vigour as our weak and dilapidated state would admit, but it was a day of trial to us all, for the Spaniards and we Americans could not well understand each other's plans, and they being naturally petulant, would not work nor listen with any patience for Joseph, our English fellow prisoner, to explain our views. They would sometimes undo what they had done, and in a few minutes replace it again. However, before night we began to caulk her seams, by means of pieces of hard mangrove, made in form of a caulking iron, and had the satisfaction of seeing her in a form something like a boat. Thursday, 31st. Went on with the work, some at caulking, others at battening the seams with strips of canvas and pieces of pine nailed over, to keep the oakum in. Having found a suitable pole for a mast, the rest went about making a sail from the one we had used for a covering, also fitting oars of short pieces of boards in form of a paddle tied on a pole, we having a piece of fishing line brought by one of the prisoners. Thus, at 3 p.m. the boat was completed and put afloat. We had all this time confidently hoped that she would be sufficiently large and strong to carry us all. We made a trial and were disappointed. This was indeed a severe trial, and the emotions it called up were not easy to be suppressed. She proved leaky, for we had no carpenter's yard or smith's shop to go to, and now the question was, who should go, and how many? I found it necessary for 6, 4 to row, 1 to steer, and 1 to bail. 3 of the Spaniards and the Frenchman claimed the right, as being best acquainted with the nearest inhabitants. Likewise, they had when taken 2 boats left at St. Maria, about 40 miles distant, which they were confident of finding. They promised to return within 2 or 3 days for the rest of us. I thought it best to consent. Mr. Bracket, it was agreed, should go in my stead, because my papers must accompany me as a necessary protection, and my men apprehended danger if they were lost. Joseph Baxter, I think was his name, they wished should go, because he could speak both languages, leaving Manuel, George, Thomas, and myself to wait their return. Having thus made all arrangements, and putting up a keg of the least salt water, with a few pancakes of salt fish, they set off a little before sunset, with our best wishes and prayers for their safety and return to our relief. To launch off into the wide ocean, with strength almost exhausted, and in such a frail boat as this, you will say was very hazardous, and in truth it was, but what else was left to us? Their intention was to touch at the key where the Exertion was, and if no boat was to be found there, to proceed to St. Maria, and if none there, to go to Trinidad and send us relief. But alas! it was the last time I ever saw them. Our suffering this day was most acute. Tuesday, 5th. About 10 o'clock a.m. discovered a boat drifting by on the southeastern side of the island about a mile distant. I deemed it a providential thing to us, and urged Thomas and George trying the raft for her. They reluctantly consented and set off, but it was nearly 3 p.m. when they came up with her. It was the same boat we had built. Where then was my friend Bracket and those who went with him? Every appearance was unfavourable. I hoped that a good Providence had yet preserved him. The 2 men who went for the boat, found it full of water, without oars, paddle, or sail. Being in this condition, and about 3 miles to the leeward, the men found it impossible to tow her up, so left her, and were about 11 o'clock at night getting back with the raft. They were so exhausted that had it not been nearly calm, they could never have returned. Wednesday, 6th. This morning was indeed the most gloomy I had ever experienced. There appeared hardly a ray of hope that my friend Bracket could return, seeing the boat was lost. Our provisions nearly gone, our mouths parched extremely with thirst, our strength wasted, our spirits broken, and our hopes imprisoned within the circumference of this desolate island in the midst of an unfrequented ocean, all these things gave to the scene around us the hue of death. In the midst of this dreadful despondence, a sail hove in sight bearing the white flag. Our hopes were raised, of course, but no sooner raised than darkened by hearing a gun fired. Here then was another gang of pirates. She soon, however, came near enough to anchor, and her boat pushed off towards us with 3 men in her. Thinking it now no worse to die by sword than famine, I walked down immediately to meet them. I knew them not. A moment before the boat touched the ground, a man leaped from her bows, and caught me in his arms. It was Nickola, saying, "Do you now believe Nickola is your friend?" "Yes," said he, "Jemison will yet prove himself so." No words can express my emotions at this moment. This was a friend indeed. The reason of my not recognizing them before was that they had cut their beards and whiskers. Turning to my fellow sufferers, Nickola asked, "Are these all that are left of you? Where are the others?" At this moment, seeing David's grave, "Are they dead, then? Ah! I suspected it. I know what you were put here for." As soon as I could recover myself, I gave him an account of Mr. Bracket and the others. "How unfortunate," he said. "They must be lost, or some pirates have taken them. But," he continued, "we have no time to lose. You had better embark immediately with us, and go where you please. We are at your service." The other 2 in the boat were Frenchmen, one named Lyon, the other paroquet. They affectionately embraced each of us, then holding to my mouth the nose of a tea kettle, filled with wine, said, "Drink plenty, no hurt you." I drank as much as I judged prudent. They then gave it to my fellow sufferers. I experienced almost immediate relief, not feeling it in my head. They had also brought in the boat for us a dish of salt beef and potatoes, of which we took a little; then sent the boat on board for the other 2 men, being 5 in all, who came ashore, and rejoiced enough was I to see among them Thomas Young, one of my crew, who was detained on board the Mexican, but had escaped through Nickola's means; the other a Frenchman, named John Cadet. I now thought again and again, with troubled emotion, of my dear friend Bracket's fate. I took the last piece of paper I had, and wrote with a pencil a few words, informing him, should he come there, that I and the rest were safe; that I was not mistaken in the friend in whom I had placed so much confidence; that he had accomplished my highest expectations, and that I should go immediately to Trinidad, and requested him to go there also, and apply to Mr. Isaac W. Lord, my consignee, for assistance. I put the paper into a junk bottle, previously found on the beach, put in a stopper, and left it, together with what little flour remained, a keg of water brought from Nickola's vessel, and a few other things which I thought might be of service to him. We then repaired with our friends on board, where we were kindly treated. She was a sloop from Jamaica, of about 12 tons, with a cargo of rum and wine, bound to Trinidad. I asked which way they intended to go. They said, to Jamaica if agreeable to me. As I preferred Trinidad, I told them, if they would give me the Exertion's boat which was alongside, beside their own, some water and provisions, we would take chance in her. For perhaps, said I, you will fare better at Jamaica than at Trinidad. After a few minutes' consultation, they said, you are too much exhausted to row the distance of 100 miles, therefore we will go and carry you. We consider ourselves at your service. I expressed a wish to take a look at the Exertion, possibly we might hear something of Mr. Bracket. Nickola said very well, so got under way, and run for her, having a light westerly wind. He then related to me the manner of their desertion from the pirates. As nearly as I can recollect his own words, he said, a few days since the pirates took 4 small vessels, I believe Spaniards. They having but 2 officers for the 2 first, the third fell to me as prize master, and having an understanding with the 3 Frenchmen and Thomas, selected them for my crew, and went on board with orders to follow the Mexican, which I obeyed. The 4th, the pirates took out all but 1 man, and bade him also follow their vessel. Now our schooner leaked so bad, that we left her, and in her stead agreed to take this little sloop, which we are now in, together with the 1 man. The night being very dark, we all agreed to desert the pirates, altered our course, and touched at St. Maria, where we landed the 1 man, saw no boats there, could hear nothing from you, and agreed one and all, at the risk of our lives, to come and liberate you if you were alive, knowing as we did that you were put on this key to perish. On our way we boarded the Exertion, thinking possibly you might have been there. On board her we found a sail and paddle. We took one of the pirates' boats which they had left alongside of her, which proves how we came by 2 boats. My friend, the circumstance I am now about to relate will somewhat astonish you. When the pirates' boat with Bolidar was sent to the before mentioned key, on the 19th of January, it was their intention to leave you prisoners there, where was nothing but salt water and mangroves, and no possibility of escape. This was the plan of Baltazar, their abandoned pilot; but Bolidar's heart failed him, and he objected to it. Then, after a conference, Captain Jonnia ordered you to be put on the little island from whence we have now taken you. But after this was done, that night the French and Portuguese part of the Mexican's crew protested against it, so that Captain Jonnia, to satisfy them, sent his large boat to take you and your fellow prisoners back again, taking care to select his confidential Spaniards for this errand. And you will believe me they set off from the Mexican, and after spending about as much time as would really have taken them to come to you, they returned, and reported they had been to your island, and landed, and that none of you were there, somebody having taken you off. This all my companions here know to be true. I knew it was impossible you could have been liberated, and therefore we determined among ourselves, that should an opportunity occur, we would come and save your lives, as we now have. He then expressed, as he hitherto had done, and I believe with sincerity, his disgust with the bad company which he had been in, and looked forward with anxiety to the day when he might return to his native country. I advised him to get on board an American vessel, whenever an opportunity offered, and come to the United States, and on his arrival direct a letter to me, repeating my earnest desire to make some return for the disinterested friendship which he had shown toward me. With the Frenchman I had but little conversation, being unacquainted with the language. Here ended Nickola's account. And now, said the Frenchman, our hearts be easy. Nicola observed he had left all, and found us. I gave them my warmest tribute of gratitude, saying I looked upon them under God as the preservers of our lives, and promised them all the assistance which my situation might enable me to afford. This brings me to Thursday evening, 7th, when at 11 o'clock we anchored at the creek's mouth near the Exertion. I was anxious to board her. Accordingly took with me Nicola, Thomas, George, and 2 others, well armed, each with a musket and cutlass. I jumped on her deck, saw a fire in the camboose, but no person there. I called aloud Mr. Brackett's name several times, saying, "It is Captain Lincoln, don't be afraid, but show yourself," but no answer was given. She had no masts, spars, rigging, furniture, provisions, or anything left, except her bowsprit, and a few barrels of salt provisions of her cargo. Her ceiling had holes cut in it, no doubt in their foolish search for money. I left her with peculiar emotions, such as I hope never again to experience, and returned to the little sloop, where we remained till Friday 8th, when I had disposition to visit the island on which we were first imprisoned. Found nothing there. Saw a boat among the mangroves, near the Exertion. Returned and got under way immediately for Trinidad. In the night, while under full sail, run aground on a sunken key, having rocks above the water, resembling old stumps of trees. We, however, soon got off and anchored. Most of those keys have similar rocks about them, which navigators must carefully guard against. Monday, 11th. Got under way. Saw a brig at anchor about 5 miles below the mouth of the harbor. We hoped to avoid her speaking us, but when we opened in sight of her, discovered a boat making towards us, with a number of armed men in her. This alarmed my friends, as we did not see the brig's ensign hoisted. They declared the boat was a pirate, and looking through the spy glass, they knew some of them to be the Mexican's men. This state of things was quite alarming. They said, "We will not be taken alive by them." Immediately the boat fired a musket. The ball passed through our mainsail. My friends insisted on beating them off. I endeavoured to dissuade them, believing, as I did, that the brig was a Spanish man of war, who had sent her boat to ascertain who we were. I thought we had better heave to. Immediately another shot came. Then they insisted on fighting, and said, if I would not help them, I was no friend. I reluctantly acquiesced, and handed up the guns, commenced firing upon them, and they upon us. We received several shot through the sails, but no one was hurt on either side. Our boats had been cast adrift to make us go the faster, and we gained upon them, continued firing until they turned from us, and went for our boats, which they took in tow for the brig. Soon after this it became calm. Then I saw the brig had us in her power. She manned and armed 2 more boats for us. We now concluded, since we had scarcely any ammunition, to surrender, and were towed down alongside the brig on board, and were asked by the captain, who could speak English, what for you fire on the boat? I told him we thought her a pirate, and did not like to be taken by them again, having already suffered too much, showing my papers. He said, Captain Americana, never mind, go and take some dinner. Which are your men? I pointed them out to him, and he ordered them the liberty of the decks, but my friend Nicola and his 3 associates were immediately put in irons. They were, however, afterwards taken out of irons and examined, and I understood the Frenchmen agreed to enlist, as they judged it the surest way to better their condition. Whether Nicola enlisted I do not know, but think that he did, as I understood that offer was made to him. I however endeavoured to explain more distinctly to the captain the benevolent efforts of these 4 men by whom my life had been saved, and used every argument in my power to procure their discharge. I also applied to the governor, and exerted myself with peculiar interest, dictated as I trust with heartfelt gratitude, and I ardently hope ere this, that Nicola is on his way to this country, where I may have an opportunity of convincing him that such an act of benevolence will not go unrewarded. Previous to my leaving Trinidad, I made all the arrangements in my power with my influential friends, and doubt not that their laudable efforts will be accomplished. The sloop's cargo was then taken on board the brig, after which the captain requested a certificate that I was politely treated by him, saying that his name was Captain Candame, of the privateer brig Prudente of 18 guns. This request I complied with. His first lieutenant told me he sailed out of Boston, as commander for T.C. Armory, Esquire, during the last war. In the course of the evening my friends were taken out of irons, and examined separately, then put back again. The captain invited me to supper in his cabin, and a berth for the night, which was truly acceptable. The next morning after breakfast, I with my people were set on shore with the few things we had, with the promise of the Exertion's small boat in a day or two, but it was never sent me. The reason, let the reader imagine. On landing at the wharf Castledar, we were immediately taken by soldiers to the guard house, which was a very filthy place, thinking, I suppose, and even calling us, pirates. Soon some friends came to see me. Mr. Cotton, who resides there, brought us in some soup. Mr. Isaac W. Lord, of Boston, my merchant, came with Captain Tate, who sent immediately to the governor, for I would not show my papers to any one else. He came about sunset, and after examining Manuel, my Spanish fellow prisoner, and my papers, said to me, giving me the papers, "Captain, you are at liberty." I was kindly invited by Captain Matthew Rice, of schooner Galaxy, of Boston, to go on board his vessel, and live with him during my stay there. This generous offer I accepted, and was treated by him with the greatest hospitality, for I was hungered and he gave me meat, I was athirst and he gave me drink, I was naked and he clothed me, a stranger and he took me in. He likewise took Manuel and my 3 men for that night. Next day Mr. Lord rendered me all necessary assistance in making my protest. He had heard nothing from me until my arrival. I was greatly disappointed in not finding Mr. Bracket, and requested Mr. Lord to give him all needful aid if he should come there. To Captain Carnes, of the schooner Hannah, of Boston, I would tender my sincere thanks, for his kindness in giving me a passage to Boston, which I gladly accepted. To those gentlemen of Trinidad, and many captains of American vessels, who gave me sea clothing, etc., I offer my cordial gratitude. I am fully of the opinion that these ferocious pilots are linked in with many inhabitants of Cuba, and the government in many respects appears covertly to encourage them. It is with heartfelt delight that since the above narrative was written, I have learnt that Mr. Bracket and his companions are safe. He arrived at Port de Esprit, about 40 leagues east of Trinidad. A letter has been received from him, stating that he should proceed to Trinidad the first opportunity. It appears that after reaching the wreck, they found a boat from the shore, taking on board some of the Exertion's cargo, in which they proceeded to the above place. Why it was not in his power to come to our relief will no doubt be satisfactorily disclosed when he may be so fortunate as once more to return to his native country and friends. I felt great anxiety to learn what became of Jameson, who, my readers will recollect, was detained on board the Spanish brig Prudente near Trinidad. I heard nothing from him until I believe 18 months after I reached home, when I received a letter from him from Montego Bay, Jamaica, informing me that he was then residing in that island. I immediately wrote to him and invited him to come to the United States. He accordingly came on passenger with Captain Wilson of Cohosat, and arrived in Boston in August 1824. Our meeting was very affecting. Trying scenes were brought up before us, scenes gone for ever, through which we had passed together, where our acquaintance was formed, and since which time we had never met. I beheld once more the preserver of my life, the instrument, under Providence, of restoring me to my home, my family, and my friends, and I regarded him with no ordinary emotion. My family were delighted to see him, and cordially united in giving him a warm reception. He told me that after we separated in Trinidad, he remained on board the Spanish brig. The commander asked him and his companions if they would enlist. The Frenchmen replied that they would, but he said nothing, being determined to make his escape the very first opportunity which should present. The Spanish brig afterwards fell in with a Colombian Patriot, an armed brig of 18 guns. Being of about equal force, they gave battle, and fought between 3 and 4 hours. Both parties were very much injured, and, without any considerable advantage on either side, both drew off to make repairs. The Spanish brig Prudente put into St. Jago de Cuba. Jameson was wounded in the action, by a musket ball, through his arm, and was taken on shore, with the other wounded, and placed in the hospital of St. Jago. Here he remained for a considerable time, until he had nearly recovered, when he found an opportunity of escaping, and embarking for Jamaica. He arrived in safety at Kingston, and from there, travelled barefoot over the mountains, until very much exhausted he reached Montego Bay, where he had friends, and where one of his brothers possessed some property. From this place he afterwards wrote to me. He told me that before he came to Massachusetts, he saw the villainous pilot of the Mexican, the infamous Baltazar, with several other pirates, brought into Montego Bay, from whence they were to be conveyed to Kingston to be executed. Whether the others were part of the Mexican's crew or not I do not know. Baltazar was an old man, and as Jameson said, it was a melancholy and heart-rendering sight, to see him borne to execution with those grey hairs, which might have been venerable in virtuous old age, now a shame and reproach to this hoary villain, for he was full of years, and old in iniquity. When Jameson received the letter which I wrote him, he immediately embarked with Captain Wilson, and came to Boston, as I have before observed. According to his own account, he was of a very respectable family in Greenock, Scotland. His father when living was a rich cloth merchant, but both his father and mother had been dead many years. He was the youngest of 13 children, and being, as he said, of a roving disposition, had always followed the seas. He had received a polite education, and was of a very gentlemanly deportment. He spoke several living languages, and was skilled in drawing and painting. He had travelled extensively in different countries, and acquired in consequence an excellent knowledge of their manners and customs. His varied information, for hardly any subject escaped him, rendered him a very entertaining companion. His observations on the character of different nations were very liberal, marking their various traits, their virtues and vices, with playful humorousness, quite free from bigotry or narrow prejudice. I was in trade between Boston and Philadelphia at the time he came to Massachusetts, and he sailed with me several trips as my mate. He afterwards went to Cuba, and was subsequently engaged in the mackerel fishery out of the port of Hingham during the warm season, and in the winter frequently employed himself in teaching navigation to young men, for which he was eminently qualified. He remained with us until his death, which took place in 1829. At this time he had been out at sea 2 or 3 days, when he was taken sick, and was carried into Cape Cod, where he died on the 1st day of May, 1829, and there his remains lie buried. Peace be to his ashes. They rest in a strange land, far from his kindred and his native country. Since his death I have met with Mr. Stewart of Philadelphia, who was commercial agent in Trinidad at the time of my capture. He informed me that the piratical schooner Mexican was afterwards chased by an English government vessel from Jamaica, which was cruising in search of it. Being hotly pursued, the pirates deserted their vessel, and fled to the mangrove bushes, on an island similar to that on which they had placed me and my crew to die. The English surrounded them, and thus they were cut off from all hopes of escape. They remained there, I think, 14 days, when being almost entirely subdued by famine, 11 surrendered themselves and were taken. The others probably perished among the mangroves. The few who were taken were carried by the government vessel into Trinidad. Mr. Stewart said that he saw them himself, and such miserable objects that had life he never before beheld. They were in a state of starvation, their beards had grown to a frightful length, their bodies were covered with filth and vermin, and their countenances were hideous. From Trinidad they were taken to Kingston, Jamaica, and there hung on Friday, the 7th of February, 1823. About a quarter of an hour before day dawn, the wretched culprits were taken from the jail, under a guard of soldiers from the 50th regiment and the city guard. On their arrival at the Wherry Wharf, the military retired, and the prisoners, with the town guard, were put on board 2 wherries, in which they proceeded to Port Royal Point, the usual place of execution in similar cases. They were there met by a strong party of military, consisting of 50 men, under command of an officer. They formed themselves into a square round the place of execution, where the sheriff and his officers, with the prisoners in the centre. The gallows was of considerable length, and contrived with a drop so as to prevent the unpleasant circumstances which frequently occur. The unfortunate men had been in continual prayer from the time they were awakened out of a deep sleep till they arrived at that place, where they were to close their existence. They all expressed their gratitude for the attention they had met with from the sheriff and the inferior officers. Many pressed the hands of the turnkey to their lips, others to their hearts, and on their knees prayed that God, Jesus Christ, and the Virgin Mary would bless him and the other jailers for their goodness. They all then fervently joined in prayer. To the astonishment of all, no clerical character of any persuasion was present. They repeatedly called out, Adonde este el Padre? Where is the Holy Father? Juan Hernandez called on all persons present to hear him. He was innocent. What they had said about his confessing himself guilty was untrue. He had admitted himself guilty, because he hoped for pardon, but that now he was to die, he called God, Jesus Christ, the Holy Ghost, the Virgin Mary, and the saints to witness that he spoke the truth, that he was no pirate, no murderer, he had been forced. The lieutenant of the pirates was a wretch, who did not fear God, and had compelled him to act. Juan Gutierrez and Francisco de Sayas were loud in their protestations of innocence. Manuel Lima said for himself he did not care. He felt for the old man, Miguel Jose. How could he be a pirate who could not help himself? If it were a Christian country, they would have pardoned him for his gray hairs. He was innocent. They had both been forced. Let none of his friends or relations ever venture to sea. He hoped his death would be a warning to them, that the innocent might suffer for the guilty. The language of this young man marked him a superior to the generality of his companions in misfortune. The seaman of the Whim stated that he was very kind to them when prisoners on board the piratical vessel. Just before he was turned off, he addressed the old man. Adios, viejo, para siempre adios. Farewell, old man, forever farewell. Several of the prisoners cried out for mercy. Pardon, pardon. Domingo Ucala, the black man, then addressed them. Do not look for mercy here, but pray to God. We are all brought here to die. This is not built for nothing. Here we must end our lives. You know I am innocent, but I must die the same as you all. There is not anybody here who can do us any good, so let us think only of God Almighty. We are not children, but men. We know that all must die, and in a few years those who kill us must die too. When I was born, God set the way of my death. I do not blame anybody. I was taken by the pirates, and they made me help them. They would not let me be idle. I could not show that this was the truth, and therefore they have judged me by the people they have found me with. I am put to death unjustly, but I blame nobody. It was my misfortune. Come, let us pray. If we are innocent, so much the less we have to repent. I do not come here to accuse anyone. Death must come one day or other, better to the innocent than guilty. He then joined in prayer with the others. He seemed to be much reverenced by his fellow prisoners. He chose those prayers he thought most adapted to the occasion. Hundreds were witnesses to the manly firmness of this negro. Observing a bystander listening attentively to the complaints of one of his fellow wretches, he translated what had been said into English. With a steady pace, and a resolute and resigned countenance, he ascended the fatal scaffold. Observing the executioner unable to untie a knot on the collar of one of the prisoners, he with his teeth untied it. He then prayed most fervently till the drop fell. Miguel Jose protested his innocence. No he robado, no he matado ninguén, muro inocente. I have robbed no one, I have killed no one, I die innocent. I am an old man, but my family will feel my disgraceful death. Francisco Miguel prayed devoutly, but inaudibly. His soul seemed to have quitted the body before he was executed. Brete Guillemillet called on all to witness his innocence. It was of no use for him to say an untruth, for he was going before the face of God. Augustus Hernandez repeatedly declared his innocence, requested that no one would say he had made a confession. He had none to make. Juan Hernandez was rather obstinate when the execution pulled the cap over his eyes. He said rather passionately, Quita este mis ojos, remove it from my eyes. He then rubbed it up against one of the posts of the gallows. Miguel Jose made the same complaint, and drew the covering from his eyes by rubbing his head against a fellow sufferer. Pedro Nandre was loud in his ejaculations for mercy. He wept bitterly. He was covered with marks of deep wounds. The whole of the 10 included in the death warrant having been placed on the scaffold, and the rope suspended, the drop was let down. Nandre, being an immense heavy man, broke the rope and fell to the ground alive. Juan Hernandez struggled long. Lima was much convulsed. The old man, Gillamillet, and Magul were apparently dead before the drop fell. Eucalla, the black man, gave one convulsion, and all was over. When Nandre recovered from the fall, and saw his 9 lifeless companions stretched in death, he gave an agonizing shriek, he wrung his hands, screamed, "Favor, favor, me mata sin cosa. Oh, buenos Cristianos, me amparen, ampara me, no he Cristiano en esta tierra? Mercy, mercy, they kill me without cause. Oh, good Christians, protect me, oh, protect me. Is there no Christian in this land?" He then lifted his eyes to heaven and prayed long and loud. Upon being again suspended, he was for a long period convulsed. He was an immense powerful man, and died hard. A piratical station was taken in the island of Cuba by the U.S. schooners of war, Greyhound and Beagle. They left Thompson's Island, June 7th, 1823, under the command of Lieutenants Kearney and Newton, and cruised within the Keys on the south side of Cuba, as far as Cape Cruz, touching at all the intermediate ports on the island to intercept pirates. On the 21st of July they came to anchor off Cape Cruz, and Lieutenant Kearney went in his boat to reconnoitre the shore, when he was fired on by a party of pirates who were concealed among the bushes. A fire was also opened from several pieces of cannon erected on a hill a short distance off. The boat returned, and 5 or 6 others were manned from the vessels, and pushed off for the shore, but a very heavy cannonade being kept up by the pirates on the heights, as well as from the boats, were compelled to retreat. The 2 schooners were then warped in, when they discharged several broadsides, and covered the landing of the boats. After a short time the pirates retreated to a hill that was well fortified. A small hamlet in which the pirates resided was set fire to and destroyed. 3 guns, 1 a 4-pounder, and 2 large swivels, with several pistols, cutlasses, and 8 large boats, were captured. A cave about 150 feet deep was discovered near where the houses were, and after considerable difficulty a party of seamen got to the bottom, where was found an immense quantity of plunder, consisting of broadcloths, dry goods, female dresses, saddlery, etc. Many human bones were also in the cave, supposed to have been unfortunate persons who were taken and put to death. A great many of the articles were brought away, and the rest destroyed. About 40 pirates escaped to the heights, but many were supposed to have been killed from the fire of the schooners, as well as from the men who landed. The bushes were so thick that it was impossible to go after them. Several other caves are in the neighbourhood, in which it was conjectured they occasionally take shelter. In 1823 Commodore Porter commanded the United States squadron in these seas. Much good was done in preventing new acts of piracy, but these wretches kept aloof and did not venture to sea as formerly, but some were taken. Almost every day furnished accounts evincing the activity of Commodore Porter and the officers and men under his command, but for a long time their industry and zeal was rather shown in the suppression of piracy than the punishment of it. At length, however, an opportunity offered for inflicting the latter, as detailed in the following letter, dated Matanzas, July 10th, 1823. I have the pleasure of informing you of a brilliant achievement attained against the pirates on the 5th instant by 2 barges attached to Commodore Porter's squadron, the Gallinipper, Lieutenant Watson, 18 men, and the Mosquito, Lieutenant Inman, 10 men. The barges were returning from a cruise to windward, when they were near Jaguapa Bay, 13 leagues to windward of Matanzas. They entered it, it being a rendezvous for pirates. They immediately discovered a large schooner under way, which they supposed to be a patriot privateer, and as their stores were nearly exhausted, they hoped to obtain some supplies from her. They therefore made sail in pursuit. When they were within cannon shot distance, she rounded to and fired her long gun, at the same time run up the bloody flag, directing her course towards the shore, and continuing to fire without effect. When she had got within a short distance of the shore, she came to, with springs on her cable, continuing to fire, and when the barges were within 30 yards, they fired their muskets without touching boat or man. Our men gave 3 cheers, and prepared to board. The pirates, discovering their intention, jumped into the water, when the bargemen, calling on the name of Allen, commenced a destructive slaughter, killing them in the water and as they landed. So exasperated were our men that it was impossible for their officers to restrain them, and many were killed after orders were given to grant quarter. 27 dead were counted, some sunk, 5 taken prisoners by the bargemen, and 8 taken by a party of Spaniards on shore. The officers calculated that from 30 to 35 were killed. The schooner mounted a long 9-pounder on a pivot, and 4 4-pounders, with every other necessary armament, and a crew of 50 to 60 men, and ought to have blown the barges to atoms. She was commanded by the notorious Diablito, or Little Devil. This statement I have from Lieutenant Watson himself, and it is certainly the most decisive operation that has been effected against those murderers, either by the English or American force. This affair occurred on the same spot where the brave Allen fell about 1 year since. The prize was sent to Thompson's Island. A British sloop of war, about the same time, captured a pirate schooner off St. Domingo, with a crew of 60 men. She had $200,000 in specie, and other valuable articles on board. The brig Vestal sent another pirate schooner to New Providence. End of chapter 23, part 2.
Chapter 24 of the Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles ELLMS. Chapter 24. Adventures and Execution of Captain Jack Rackam. This Jack Rackam, as has been reported in the foregoing pages, was quartermaster to Vane's company, till the crew were divided, and Vane turned out of it for refusing to board a French man of war, Rackam being voted captain of the division that remained in the brigantine. The 24th of November, 1718, was the first day of his command. His first cruise was among the Caribbee Islands, where he took and plundered several vessels. We have already taken notice that when Captain Woodes Rogers went to the island of Providence with the king's pardon to such of the pirates as should surrender, this brigantine, which Rackam commanded, made its escape through another passage, bidding defiance to the mercy that was offered. To the windward of Jamaica, a Madeira man fell in the pirates' way, which they detained 2 or 3 days, till they had their market out of her, and then they gave her back to the master, and permitted one Hosea Tisdale, a tavern-keeper at Jamaica, who had been picked up in one of their prizes, to depart in her, she being bound for that island. After this cruise they went into a small island, and cleaned, and spent their Christmas ashore, drinking and carousing as long as they had any liquor left, and then they went to sea again for more. They succeeded but too well, though they took no extraordinary prize for above 2 months, except a ship laden with convicts from Newgate bound for the plantations, which in a few days was retaken, with all her cargo, by an English man of war that was stationed in those seas. Rackam stood towards the island of Bermuda, and took a ship bound to England from Carolina, and a small pink from New England, both of which he brought to the Bahama Islands, where, with the pitch, tar, and stores, they cleaned again, and refitted their own vessels. But staying too long in that neighbourhood, Captain Rogers, who was governor of Providence, hearing of these ships being taken, sent out a sloop well manned and armed, which retook both the prizes, though in the meanwhile the pirate had the good fortune to escape. From hence they sailed to the back of Cuba, where Rackam kept a little kind of a family, at which place they stayed a considerable time, living ashore with their Delilahs, till their money and provisions were expended, and they concluded it time to look out for more. They repaired their vessel, and were making ready to put to sea, when a Guarda de Costa came in with a small English sloop, which she had taken as an interloper on the coast. The Spanish guard ship attacked the pirate, but Rackam, being close in behind a little island, she could do but little execution where she lay. The Dons, therefore, warped the channel that evening, in order to make sure of her the next morning. Rackam, finding his case desperate, and that there was hardly any possibility of escaping, resolved to attempt the following enterprise. The Spanish prize lying for the better security close into the island, between the little island and the main, our desperado took his crew into the boat with their cutlasses, rounded the little island, and fell aboard their prize silently in the dead of night, without being discovered, telling the Spaniards that were aboard her that if they spoke a word, or made the least noise, they were all dead men, and so they became masters of her. When this was done, he slipped her cable and drove out to sea. The Spanish man of war was so intent upon their expected prize that they minded nothing else, and as soon as day broke, they made a furious fire upon the empty sloop, but it was not long before they were rightly apprised of the matter, when they cursed themselves sufficiently for a company of fools, to be bit out of a good rich prize, as she proved to be, and to have nothing but an old crazy hull in the room of her. Rackam and his crew had no occasion to be displeased at the exchange, as it enabled them to continue some time longer in a way of life that suited their depraved minds. In August 1720 we find him at sea again, scouring the harbours and inlets of the north and west parts of Jamaica, where he took several small crafts, which proved to be no great booty to the rovers, but they had but few men, and therefore were obliged to run at low game till they could increase their company and their strength. In the beginning of September they took 7 or 8 fishing boats in Harbour Island, stole their nets and other tackle, and then went off to the French part of Hispaniola, where they landed and took the cattle away, with 2 or 3 Frenchmen whom they found near the watering side, hunting wild hogs in the evening. The Frenchmen came on board, whether by consent or compulsion is not certainly known. They afterwards plundered 2 sloops, and returned to Jamaica, on the north coast of which island, near Porto Maria Bay, they took a schooner, Thomas Spenlow, master, it being then the 19th of October. The next day Rackam, seeing a sloop in Dry Harbour Bay, stood in and fired a gun. The men all ran ashore, and he took the sloop and lading, but when those ashore found that they were pirates, they hailed the sloop, and let them know they were all willing to come on board of them. Rackam's coasting the island in this matter proved fatal for him, which intelligence of his expedition came to the governor by a canoe, which he had surprised ashore in Ocho Bay. Upon this a sloop was immediately fitted out, and sent round the island in quest of him, commanded by Captain Barnett, and manned with a good number of hands. Rackam, rounding the island, and drawing round the western point, called at Point Negril, saw a small pettiaga, which, at the sight of the sloop, ran ashore and landed her men, when one of them hailed her. Answer was made that they were Englishmen, and begged the pettiaga's men to come on board and drink a bowl of punch, which they prevailed upon them to do. Accordingly, the company, in an evil hour, came all aboard of the pirate, consisting of 9 persons. They were armed with muskets and cutlasses, but what was their real design in so doing we will not pretend to say. They had no sooner laid down their arms and taken up their pipes, than Barnett's sloop, which was in pursuit of Rackam's, came in sight. The pirates, finding she stood directly towards them, feared the event, and weighed their anchor, which they had but lately let go, and stood off. Captain Barnett gave them chase, and having advantage of little breezes of wind which blew off the land, came up with her, and brought her into Port Royal, in Jamaica. About a fortnight after the prisoners were brought ashore, viz., November 16, 1720, Captain Rackam and 8 of his men were condemned and executed. Captain Rackam and 2 others were hung in chains. But what was very surprising was the conviction of the 9 men that came aboard the sloop on the same day she was taken. They were tried at an adjournment of the court on the 24th of January, the magistracy waiting all that time, it is supposed, for evidence to prove the piratical intention of going aboard the sloop, for it seems that there was no act or piracy committed by them, as appeared by the witnesses against them, 2 Frenchmen, taken by Rackam off the island of Hispaniola, who merely deposed that the prisoners came on board without any compulsion. The court considered the prisoners' cases, and the majority of the commissioners being of opinion that they were all guilty of the piracy and felony they were charged with, viz., the going over with a piratical intent to John Rackam, etc., then notorious pirates, and by them known to be so, they all received sentence of death, and were executed on the 17th of February at Gallows Point, at Port Royal. Nor holy bell, nor pastoral bleat, in former days within the vale, flapped in the bay the pirate's sheet, curses were on the gale. Rich goods lay on the sand, and murdered men, pirate and wreckers, kept their revels there. The Buccaneer. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of The Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Crandall. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles ELLMS. Chapter 25. The Life and Exploits of Anne Bonney. This female pirate was a native of Cork. Her father was an attorney, and, by his activity in business, rose to considerable respectability in that place. Anne was the fruit of an unlawful connection with his own servant maid, with whom he afterwards eloped to America, leaving his own affectionate and lawful wife. He settled at Carolina, and for some time followed his own profession, but soon commenced merchant, and was so successful as to purchase a considerable plantation. There he lived with his servant in the character of his wife, but she dying, his daughter Anne superintended the domestic affairs of her father. During her residence with her parent, she was supposed to have a considerable fortune, and was accordingly addressed by young men of respectable situations in life. It happened with Anne, however, as with many others of her youth and sex, that her feelings, and not her interest, determined her choice of a husband. She married a young sailor without a shilling. The avaricious father was so enraged that, deaf to the feelings of a parent, he turned his own child out of doors. Upon this cruel usage, and the disappointment of her fortune, Anne and her husband sailed for the island of Providence, in the hope of gaining employment. Acting a part very different from that of Mary Read, Anne's affections were soon estranged from her husband by Captain Rackam, and, eloping with him, she went to sea in men's clothes. Proving with child, the captain put her on shore, and entrusted her to the care of some friends until her recovery, when she again accompanied him in his expeditions. Upon the king's proclamation offering a pardon to all pirates, he surrendered, and went into the privateering business, as we have related before. He, however, soon embraced an opportunity to return to his favorite employment. In all his piratical exploits, Anne accompanied him, and, as we have already recorded, displayed such courage and intrepidity that she, along with Mary Read and a seaman, were the last three who remained on board when the vessel was taken. Anne was known to many of the planters in Jamaica, who remembered to have seen her in her father's house, and they were disposed to intercede in her behalf. Her unprincipled conduct, in leaving her own husband and in forming an illicit connection with Rackam, tended, however, to render her friends less active. By a special favour, Rackam was permitted to visit her the day before he was executed, but, instead of condoling with him on an account of his sad fate, she only observed that she was sorry to see him there, but, if he had fought like a man, he needed not have been hanged like a dog. Being with child, she remained in prison until her recovery, was reprieved from time to time, and though we cannot communicate to our readers any particulars of her future life, or the manner of her death, yet it is certain that she was not executed. End of chapter 25. Recording by Michelle Crandall, Fremont, California, September 2008.
Chapter 26 of The Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cori Samuel. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles ELLMS. Chapter 26. The Adventures and Heroism of Mary Read. The attention of our readers is now to be directed to the history of two female pirates, a history which is chiefly remarkable from the extraordinary circumstance of the softer sex assuming a character peculiarly distinguished for every vice that can disgrace humanity, and at the same time for the exertion of the most daring, though brutal, courage. Mary Read was a native of England, but at what place she was born is not recorded. Her mother married a sailor when she was very young, who, soon after their marriage, went to sea and never returned. The fruit of that marriage was a sprightly boy. The husband not returning, she again found herself with child, and to cover her shame, took leave of her husband's relations, and went to live in the country, taking her boy along with her. Her son in a short time died, and she was relieved from the burden of his maintenance and education. The mother had not resided long in the country before Mary Read, the subject of the present narrative, was born. After the birth of Mary, her mother resided in the country for 3 or 4 years, until her money was all spent and her ingenuity was set at work to contrive how to obtain a supply. She knew that her husband's mother was in good circumstances and could easily support her child, provided she could make her pass for a boy and her son's child. But it seemed impossible to impose upon an old, experienced mother. She, however, presented Mary in the character of her grandson. The old woman proposed to take the boy to live with her, but the mother would not on any account part with her boy. The grandmother, therefore, allowed £1 per week for his support. The ingenuity of the mother being successful, she reared the daughter as a boy. But as she grew up, she informed her of the secret of her birth, in order that she might conceal her sex. The grandmother, however, dying, the support from that quarter failed, and she was obliged to hire her out as a footboy to a French lady. The strength and manly disposition of this supposed boy increased with her years, and leaving that servile employment, she engaged on board a man-of-war. The volatile disposition of the youth did not permit her to remain long in this station, and she next went into Flanders, and joined a regiment of foot as a cadet. Though in every action she conducted herself with the greatest bravery, yet she could not obtain a commission, as they were in general bought and sold. She accordingly quitted that service, and enlisted into a regiment of horse. There she behaved herself so valiantly that she gained the esteem of all her officers. It, however, happened that her comrade was a handsome young Fleming, and she fell passionately in love with him. The violence of her feelings rendered her negligent of her duty, and effected such a change in her behaviour as attracted the attention of all. Both her comrade and the rest of the regiment deemed her mad. Love, however, is inventive, and as they slept in the same tent, she found means to discover her sex without any seeming design. He was both surprised and pleased, supposing that he would have a mistress to himself, but he was greatly mistaken, and he found that it was necessary to court her for his wife. A mutual attachment took place, and as soon as convenient, women's clothes were provided for her, and they were publicly married. The singularity of 2 troopers marrying caused a general conversation, and many of the officers honoured the ceremony with their presence, and resolved to make presents to the bride, to provide her with necessaries. After marriage they were desirous to quit the service, and their discharge being easily obtained, they set up an ordinary under the sign of the 3 Shoes, and soon acquired a considerable run of business. But Mary Read's felicity was of short duration. The husband died, and peace being concluded, her business diminished. Under these circumstances, she again resumed her man's dress, and, going into Holland, enlisted into a regiment of foot quartered in one of the frontier towns. But there being no prospect of preferment in time of peace, she went on board a vessel bound for the West Indies. During the voyage, the vessel was captured by English pirates, and as Mary was the only English person on board, they detained her, and having plundered the vessel of what they chose, allowed it to depart. Mary continued in that unlawful commerce for some time, but the royal pardon being tendered to all those in the West Indies who should, before a specified day, surrender, the crew to which she was attached availed themselves of this, and lived quietly on shore with the fruits of their adventures. But from the want of their usual supplies, their money became exhausted, and being informed that Captain Rogers in the Isle of Providence was fitting out some vessels for privateering, Mary, with some others, repaired to that island to serve on board his privateers. We have already heard that scarcely had the ships sailed when some of their crews mutinied and ran off with the ships to pursue their former mode of life. Among these was Mary Read. She indeed frequently declared that the life of a pirate was what she detested, and that she was constrained to it both on the former and present occasion. It was, however, sufficiently ascertained that both Mary Read and Anne Bonney were among the bravest and most resolute fighters of the whole crew, that when the vessel was taken, these 2 heroines, along with another of the pirates, were the last 3 upon deck, and that Mary, having in vain endeavoured to rouse the courage of the crew who had fled below, discharged a pistol amongst them, killing one and wounding another. Nor was Mary less modest than brave, for though she had remained many years in the character of a sailor, yet no one had discovered her sex until she was under the necessity of doing so to Anne Bonney. The reason of this was that Anne, supposing her to be a handsome fellow, became greatly enamoured of her, and discovered her sex and wishes to Mary, who was thus constrained to reveal her secret to Anne. Rackam, being the paramour of Bonney, and observing her partiality towards Mary, threatened to shoot her lover, so that to prevent any mischief, Anne also informed the captain of the sex of her companion. Rackam was enjoined to secrecy, and here he behaved honourably, but love again assailed the conquered Mary. It was usual with the pirates to retain all the artists who were captured in the trading vessels. Among these was a very handsome young man, of engaging manners, who vanquished the heart of Mary. In a short time her love became so violent that she took every opportunity of enjoying his company and conversation, and, after she had gained his friendship, discovered her sex. Esteem and friendship were speedily converted into the most ardent affection, and a mutual flame burned in the hearts of these two lovers. An occurrence soon happened that put the attachment of Mary to a severe trial. Her lover having quarrelled with one of the crew, they agreed to fight a duel on shore. Mary was all anxiety for the fate of her lover, and she manifested a greater concern for the preservation of her life than that of her own, but she could not entertain the idea that he could refuse to fight, and so be esteemed a coward. Accordingly, she quarrelled with the man who challenged her lover, and called him to the field 2 hours before his appointment with her lover, engaged him with sword and pistol, and laid him dead at her feet. Though no esteem or love had formerly existed, this action was sufficient to have kindled the most violent flame, but this was not necessary, for the lovers' attachment was equal, if not stronger than her own. They pledged their faith, which was esteemed as binding as if the ceremony had been performed by a clergyman. Captain Rackam one day, before he knew that she was a woman, asked her why she followed a line of life that exposed her to so much danger, and at last to the certainty of being hanged. She replied that, as to hanging, she thought it no great hardship, for were it not for that, every cowardly fellow would turn pirate, and so infest the seas, and men of courage would starve. That if it were put to her choice, she would not have the punishment less than death, the fear of which kept some dastardly rogues honest. That many of those who are now cheating the widows and orphans, and oppressing their poor neighbours who have no money to obtain justice, would then rob at sea, and the ocean would be as crowded with rogues as the land, so that no merchants would venture out, and the trade in a little time would not be worth following. Being with child at the time of her trial, her execution was delayed, and it is probable that she would have found favour, but in the meantime she fell sick and died. Mary Read was of a strong and robust constitution, capable of enduring much exertion and fatigue. She was vain and bold in her disposition, but susceptible of the tenderest emotions and of the most melting affections. Her conduct was generally directed by virtuous principles, while at the same time she was violent in her attachments. Though she was inadvertently drawn into that dishonourable mode of life which has stained her character, and given her a place among the criminals noticed in this work, yet she possessed a rectitude of principle and of conduct far superior to many who have not been exposed to such temptations to swerve from the path of female virtue and honour. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of The Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Christ. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles ELLMS. Chapter 27. The Algerine Pirates. Containing accounts of the cruelties and atrocities of the Barbary corsairs, with narratives of the expeditions sent against them, and the final capture of Algiers by the French in 1830. That former den of pirates, the city of Algiers, is situated on the shores of a pretty deep bay, by which the northern coast of Africa is here indented, and may be said to form an irregular triangular figure, the base line of which abuts on the sea, while the apex is formed by the Casauba, or citadel, which answered the double purpose of a fort to defend and awe the city, and a palace for the habitation of the Dey and his court. The hill on which the city is built slopes rather rapidly upwards, so that every house is visible from the sea, in consequence of which it was always sure to suffer severely from a bombardment. The top of the hill has an elevation of nearly 500 feet, and exactly at this point is built the citadel, the whole town lying between it and the sea. The houses of Algiers have no roofs, but are all terminated by terraces, which are constantly whitewashed. and as the exterior walls, the fort, the batteries, and the walls are similarly beautified, the whole city from a distance looks not unlike a vast chalk quarry opened on the side of a hill. The fortifications towards the sea are of amassing strength, and with the additions made since Lord Exmouth's attack, may be considered as almost impregnable. They occupy the entire of a small island which lies a short distance in front of the city, to which it is connected at one end by a magnificent mole of solid masonry, while the other, which commands the entrance of the port, is crowned with a battery, bristling with cannon of immense caliber, which would instantly sink any vessel which should now attempt to occupy the station taken by the Queen Charlotte on that memorable occasion. On the land side, the defences are by no means of equal strength, as they were always considered rather as a shelter against an insurrectionary movement of the natives than as intended to repulse the regular attacks of a disciplined army. In fact, defences on this side would be of little use, as the city is completely commanded by different hills, particularly that on which the Emperor's fort is built, and was obliged instantly to capitulate as soon as this latter had fallen into the hands of the French in 1830. There are 4 gates, one opening on the mole, which is thence called the Marine Gate, one near the citadel, which is termed the New Gate, and the other 2 at the north and south sides of the city, with the principal street running between them. All these gates are strongly fortified, and outside the 3 land gates run the remains of a ditch, which once surrounded the city, but is now filled up except at these points. The streets of Algiers are all crooked and all narrow. The best are scarcely 12 feet in breadth, and even half of this is occupied by the projections of the shops, or the props placed to support the first stories of the houses, which are generally made to advance beyond the lower, insomuch that in many places a laden mule can scarcely pass. Of public buildings, the most remarkable is the Casauba, or citadel, the situation of which we have already mentioned. It is a huge, heavy-looking brick building of a square shape, surrounded by high and massive walls, and defended by 50 pieces of cannon and some mortars, so placed as equally to all the city and country. The apartments set apart for the habitation of the Dey and the ladies of his harem are described as extremely magnificent, and abundantly supplied with marble pillars, fountains, mirrors, carpets, ottomans, cushions, and other articles of oriental luxury. There are others no less valuable and curious, such as the armory, furnished with weapons of every kind, of the finest manufacture, and in the greatest abundance, the treasury, containing not only a profusion of the precious metals, coined or in ingots, but also diamonds, pearls, rubies, and other precious stones of great value, and lastly, the storerooms of immense extent, in which were piled up the richest silk stuffs, velvets, brocades, together with wool, wax, sugar, iron, lead, saber blades, gun barrels, and all the different productions of the Algerine territories. For the Dey was not only the first robber, but the first merchant in his own dominions. Next to the Casauba, the mole with the marine forts presented the handsomest and most imposing pile of buildings. The mole is no less than 1,300 feet in length, forming a beautiful terrace walk, supported by arches, beneath which lay splendid magazines, which the French found filled with spars, hemp, cordage, cables, and all manner of marine stores. At the extremity of the mole lay the barracks of the Janissaries, entrusted with the defense of the marine forts, and consisting of several small separate chambers, in which they each slept on sheepskin mats, while in the center was a long, handsome coffee-room. The bagnios were the buildings in which Europeans for a long time felt the most interest, inasmuch as it was in these that the Christian slaves taken by the corsairs were confined. For many years previous to the French invasion, however, the number of prisoners had been so trifling that many of these terrific buildings had fallen into decay, and presented, when the French army entered Algiers, little more than piles of mouldering ruins. The inmates of the bagnio, when taken by the French, were the crews of 2 French brigs, which a short time before had been wrecked off Cape Bengut, a few French prisoners of war made during their advance, and about 20 Greek and Genoese sailors, who had been there for 2 years, and all about 120. They represented their condition as bad, though by no means so deplorable as it would have been in former days. The prison was at first so close that there was some danger of suffocation, to avoid which the Turks made holes in the walls, but as they neglected to supply these with windows or shutters of any kind, there was no means of excluding wind or rain, from which consequently they often suffered. We shall only trace these pirates back to about the year 1500, when Salem, king of Algiers, being invaded by the Spaniards, at last entreated the assistance of the famous corsair Rouge Rice, better known by his European name, Barbarossa, composed of 2 Italian words signifying red beard. Nothing could be more agreeable than the number of hardihood of his naval exploits had been such an invitation to this ambitious robber, who elated by for some time considering how he might best establish his power by land. Accordingly, attended by 5,000 picked men, he entered Algiers, made himself master of the town, assassinated Salem, and had himself proclaimed king in his stead. And thus was established that nest of pirates, fresh swarms from which never ceased to annoy Christian commerce and enslave Christian mariners, until its late final destruction by the French expedition in 1830. In a piratical career of many centuries, the countless thousands who have been taken, enslaved, and perished in bondage by these monsters should long ago have drawn upon them the united vengeance of all Christendom. Many a youth of family and fortune, of delicate constitution, has been captured and sold in the slave market. His labor through the long hot days would be to cleanse out the foul bed of some large empty reservoir, where he would be made to strip, and, descending into the pond, bring up in his arms the black stinking mud, heaped up and pressed against his bosom, or to labor in drawing huge blocks of stone to build the mole, or in building and repairing the fortifications, with numerous other painful and disgusting tasks. The only food was a scanty supply of black bread, and occasionally a few decayed olives, or sheep which had died from some disorder. At night they were crowded into that most horrid of prisons, the bagnio, to sleep on a little filthy straw amidst the most noisome stenches, their limbs in chains, and often receiving the lash. Occasionally an individual would be ransomed, when his story would draw tears of pity from all who heard it. Ladies were frequently taken by these monsters and treated in the most inhuman manner, and sometimes whole families were enslaved. Numerous facts of the most heart-rending description are on record, but our limits oblige us to be brief. A Spanish lady, the wife of an officer, with her son, a youth of 14, and her daughter, 6 years old, were taken in a Spanish vessel by the Algerines. The barbarians treated her and both her children with the greatest inhumanity. The eldest they kept in chains, and the defenseless little one they wantonly treated so ill that the unhappy mother was often nearly deprived of her reason at the blows her infant received from these wretches, who plundered them of everything. They kept them many days at sea on hard and scanty fare, covered only with a few soiled rags, and in this state brought them to Algiers. They had been long confined in a dreadful dungeon in the bagnio, where the slaves are kept, when a messenger was sent to the aga, or captain of the bagnio, for a female slave. It fortunately fell to the lot of the Spanish lady, but at the instant when she was embracing her son, who was tearing himself from his mother with haggard and disordered looks, to go to his imperious drivers, and, while in despair, she gazed on her little worn-out infant, she heard herself summoned to attend the guard of the prison to a family that had sent for a female slave. She obtained permission to take her little daughter with her. She dreaded being refused, and sent back to the horrid dungeon she was leaving, where no difference was paid to rank, and slaves of all conditions were huddled together. She went, therefore, prepared to accept of anything short of these sufferings. She was refused, as being in every respect opposite to the description of the person sent for. At length her entreaties and tears prevailed. Compassion overruled every obstacle, and she, with her little girl, was accepted. But there remained another difficulty. She had left her son chained in the midst of that dungeon from which she had just been rescued. Her kind patron soon learned the cause of her distress, but to send for the youth and treat him kindly, or in any way above that of a common slave, must hazard the demand of so large a ransom for him and his mother, as would forever preclude the hope of liberty. He was, however, sent for, and the menial offices they were both engaged to perform were only nominal. With circumspection the whole family were sheltered in this manner for 3 years. When the war with the Spaniards growing more inveterate, the Algerines demanded the youth back to the bagnio, to work in common with the other slaves, in repairing the damages done to the fortresses by the Spanish cannon. He was now compelled to go, loaded with heavy stones, through the whole of the town, and at almost every step he received dreadful blows, not being able to hasten his pace from the great weight. Overcome at last with ill usage, the delicacy of his form and constitution gave way to the excessive labor, and he one morning refused the orders of his master or driver to rise from the straw on which he was stretched, declaring they might kill him if he chose, for he would not even try to carry another load of stones. Repeated messages had been sent from the Venetian consuls, where his mother and sister were sheltered, to the aga to return him, and when the Algerines found that they had absolutely reduced him so near death, they thought it best to spare his life for the sake of future ransom. They agreed, therefore, to let him return to the Christians. His life was for some time despaired of, but through the kind attention he received, he was rescued from the threatened dissolution. His recovery was concealed for fear of his being demanded back to work, and a few months after, the Spanish peace of 1784 being concluded, a ransom was accepted by the Algerines for the suffering family, and they were set at liberty. These pirates in old times extended their depredations into the Atlantic as far as the British Channel. They swarmed in the Mediterranean, not only belonging to Algiers, but Tunis and other ports on the coast of Barbary. their corsairs making descents on the coasts of those countries which border on the Mediterranean, pillaging the villages and carrying off the inhabitants into slavery. The corsairs were vessels of different descriptions, some large armed ships and latterly frigates, others were row galleys and the various craft used by the nations which navigate that sea, and had been taken by them and added to their marine. Upon the slaves being landed at Algiers, they were marched to the Dey's or Bashal's palace, when he selected the number which according to law belonged to him, and the rest were sold in the slave market to the highest bidder. A moiety of the plunder, cargoes and vessels taken also belonged to the Dey. Occasionally a person pretending to renounce his religion and turning Mahometan would have his sufferings mitigated. The most desperate attempts were sometimes made to effect an escape from these ruthless monsters, which occasionally succeeded. In 1644, William Oakley and 4 companions escaped from Algiers in a most miraculous manner in a canvas boat. There was at this time an English clergyman, Mr. Spratt, in captivity, and the wretched slaves had the privilege of meeting in a cellar where he would pray with them. Oakley had got into the good graces of his master, and was allowed his time by giving his master $2 a month. He traded in tobacco and a few trifling articles, so that a strict watch was not kept on his movements. He conceived the project of making a canvas boat. He says, I now first opened my design to my comrades, informing them that I had contrived the model of a boat, which, being formed in pieces and afterwards put together, might be the means of our deliverance. They greedily grasped at the prospect, but cooler reflection pointed out difficulties innumerable. Some of them started objections which they thought insuperable, and these I endeavored to overrule. We began our work in the cellar, which had served for our devotions, though it was not the sanctity of the place, but its privacy, that induced us to the selection. We first provided a piece of wood 12 feet long, and that it might escape observation, it was cut in two, being jointed in the middle. Next we procured the timbers of ribs, which, to avoid the same hazard, were in 3 pieces each, and jointed in 2 places. The flat side of one of the 2 pieces was laid over the other, and 2 holes bored in every joint to receive nails, so that when united, each joint would make an obtuse angle, and approach towards a semicircular figure as we required. We had in the formation of an external covering, to avoid hammering and nailing, which would have made such a noise in the cellar as to attract the notice of the Algerines, who were insufferably suspicious about their wives and slaves. Therefore we provided as much canvas as would cover the boat twice over, and as much pitch, tar, and tallow as would make it a kind of tarpaulin, as also earthen pots in which to melt our materials. The 2 carpenters and myself were appointed to this service in the cellar. We stopped up all chinks and crevices, that the fumes of these substances might not betray us. But we had not been long at work when the smell of the melting materials overcame me, and obligated me to go into the streets, gasping for breath, where, meeting with the cool air, I swooned away, and broke my face in the fall. My companions, finding me in this plight, carried me back, extremely sick and unserviceable. Before long, I heard one of them complain of sickness, and thus he could proceed no further. Therefore I saw if we abandoned our project this night, it might not be resumed, which made me resolve to set the cellar door wide open, while I stood sentinel to give notice of approaching danger. In this way we finished the whole, and then carried it to my shop, which was about a furlong distant. Everything was fitted in the cellar, the timbers to the keel, the canvas to the timbers, and the seats to the hole, and then all were taken to pieces again. It was a matter of difficulty, however, to get the pieces conveyed out of the city, but William Adams carried the keel, and hid it at the bottom of a hedge. The rest was carried away with similar precautions. As I was carrying a piece of canvas which we had bought for a sail, I looked back, and discovered the same spy who had formerly given us much trouble, following behind. This gave me no small concern, but, observing an Englishman washing clothes by the seaside, I desired his help in washing the canvas. Just as we were engaged with it, the spy came up, and stood on a rock exactly over our heads to watch us. Therefore, to delude him, I took the canvas and spread it before his face on the top of the rock to dry. He stayed his own time, and then marched off. Still, I was jealous of his intentions, which induced me to carry the canvas, when dry, straight back to the city, an incident that greatly discouraged my comrades. We also procured a small quantity of provisions, and 2 goatskins full of fresh water. In the meantime, I paid my patron my wonted visits, kept up a fair correspondence, and duly gave him his demands, while I secretly turned all my goods to ready money as fast as I could, and putting it into a trunk with a false bottom, I committed it to the charge of Mr. Spratt, who faithfully preserved it for me. The place which we chose for joining the boat together was a hill about a half-mile from the city, thinking by that means the better to descry the approach of danger. When the pieces were united and the canvas drawn on, 4 of our number carried the boat down to the sea, where, stripping ourselves naked and putting our clothes within, we carried it as far as we could wade, lest it might be injured by the stones or rocks near the shore. But we soon discovered that our calculations of lading were erroneous. for no sooner had we embarked than the water came in over the sides, and she was like to sink, so that some new device became necessary. At last, one whose heart most failed him was willing to be excluded, and wished rather to hazard the uncertain torments of land than the certainty of being drowned at sea. However, the boat was still so deeply laden that we all concluded that it was impossible to venture to sea. At length another went ashore, and she held her head stoutly, and seemed sufficiently capable of our voyage. Taking a solemn farewell of our 2 companions left behind, and wishing them as much happiness as could be hoped for in slavery, and they to us as long a life as could be expected by men going to their graves, we launched out on the 30th of June, 1644, a night ever to be remembered. Our company consisted of John Anthony, William Adams, John Jeffs, John the carpenter, and myself. We now put to sea, without helm, tackle, or compass. 4 of us continually labored at the oars. The employment of the 5th was bailing out the water that leaked through the canvas. We struggled hard the first night to get out of the reach of our old masters, but when the day broke we were still within sight of their ships in the haven and roadstead. Yet, our boat being small, and lying close and snug upon the sea, either was not discovered at all, or else seemed something that was not worth taking up. On all occasions we found our want of foresight, for now the bread which had lain soaking in the salt water was quite spoiled, and the tanned skins imparted a nauseous quality to the fresh water. So long as bread was bread, we made no complaints. With careful economy it lasted 3 days, but then pale famine, which is the most horrible shape in which death can be painted, began to stare us in the face. The expedients on which we fell to assuage our thirst rather inflamed it, and several things added to our distress. For some time the wind was right against us. Our labor was incessant, for although much rowing did not carry us forward, still cessation of it drove us back, and the season was raging hot, which rendered our toil insupportable. One small alleviation we had in the man whose province it was to bail the water out of the boat. He threw it on our bodies to cool them. However, what with the scorching of the sun and the cooling of the water, our skin was blistered all over. By day we were stark naked. By night we had on shirts or loose coats, for we had left our clothing ashore on purpose to lighten the boat. One of our number had a pocket dial which supplied the place of a compass, and, to say the truth, was not ill befitting such a vessel and such mariners. By its aid we steered our course by day, while the stars served as a guide by night, and, if they were obscured, we guessed our way by the motion of the clouds. In this woeful plight we continued 4 days and nights. On the 5th day we were at the brink of despair, and abandoned all hopes of safety. Thence we ceased our labor, and laid aside our oars, for either we had no strength left to use them, or were reluctant to waste the little we had to no purpose. Still we kept emptying the boat, loth to drown, loth to die, yet knowing no means to avoid death. They that act least commonly wish the most, and, when we had forsaken useful labor, we resorted to fruitless wishes, that we might be taken up by some ship, if it were but a ship, no matter of what country. While we lay holing up and down, our hopes at so low an ebb, we discovered a tortoise not far from us asleep in the sea. Had the great Drake discovered the Spanish plate fleet, he could not have been more rejoiced. Once again we bethought ourselves of our oars, and silently rowing to our prey, took it into the boat in great triumph. Having cut off its head, and let it bleed in the vessel, we drank the blood, ate the liver, and sucked the flesh. Our strength and spirits were woefully refreshed, and our work was vigorously renewed. Leaving our fears behind us, we began to gather hope, and, about noon, discovered, or thought we discovered, land. It is impossible to describe our joy and triumph on this occasion. It was new life to us. It brought fresh blood into our veins, and fresh vigor into our pale cheeks. We looked like persons raised from the dead. After further exertion, becoming more confident, we were at last fully satisfied that it was land. Now, like distracted persons, we all leapt into the sea, and, being good swimmers, cooled our parched bodies, never considering that we might become a ready prey to the sharks. But we presently returned to our boat, and, from being wearied with the exertion, and somewhat cooled by the sea, lay down to sleep with as much security as if it had been in our beds. It was fortunately of such short duration that the leaking of the boat occasioned no danger. Refreshed by sleep, we found new strength for our work, and tugged hard at the oar, in hopes of reaching a more stable element before night. But our progress was very slow. Towards evening an island was discovered, which was Fromentere, having already seen Majorca. At least some of our company who had navigated these seas declared that it was so. We debated long to which of the two our course should be directed, and, because the last discovered was much infested with venomous serpents, we all resolved to make for Majorca. The whole of that night we rowed very hard, and also the next, being the 6th from our putting to sea. The island was in sight all day, and about 10 at night we came under land, but it consisted of rocks so steep and craggy that we could not climb up. Whilst under these rocks a vessel approached very near. Let the reader conceive our apprehensions, after all our toil and labor, of being seized by some Turkish privateer, such as are never off the seas. Thus we were obliged to lie close, and, when the vessel had passed, we crept gently along the coast as near as we durst to the shore, until finding a suitable place to receive our weather-beaten boat. We were not insensible of our deliverance on reaching land, though, like men just awakened from a dream, we could not duly appreciate the greatness of it. Having had no food since we got the tortoise, John Anthony and myself set out in search of fresh water, and 3 remained with the boat. Before proceeding far, we found ourselves in a wood, which created great embarrassment. My comrade wished to go one way, and I wished to go another. How frail and impotent a being is man! That we, whom common dangers by sea had united, should now fall out about our own inclinations at land. Yet so we did. He gave me reproachful words, and it is well that we did not come to blows, but I went my way, and he, seeing me resolute, followed. The path led to one of those watchtowers which the Spaniards keep on the coast to give timely notice of the approach of privateers. Afraid of being fired on, we called to the sentinel, informing him who we were, and earnestly requesting him to direct us to fresh water, and to give us some bread. He very kindly threw down an old mouldy cake, and directed us to a well close at hand. We drank a little water, and ate a bit of cake, which we had difficulty in swallowing, and then hastened to return to our companions in the boat to acquaint them with our success. Though not necessary to leave the boat, we did not do it without regret, but this was lulled by the importunate cravings of hunger and thirst. Therefore, making her fast ashore, we departed. Advancing, or rather crawling, towards the well, another quarrel arose amongst us, the remembrance of which is so ungrateful that I shall bury it in silence, the best tomb for controversies. One of our company, William Adams, in attempting to drink, was unable to swallow the water, and sunk to the ground, faintly exclaiming, "I am a dead man!" After much straining and forcing, he, at length, got a little over, and when we were all refreshed with cake and water, we lay down by the side of the well to wait for morning. When it was broad day, we once more applied to the sentinel to point out the way to the nearest house or town, which he did, directing us to a house about 2 miles distant. But our feet were so raw and blistered by the sun that it was long before we could get this short journey over. And then the owners of the house, concluding from our garb that we came with a pilfering design, presented a fowling piece, charging us to stand. The first of our number who could speak the language of the country mildly endeavored to undeceive him, saying we were a company of poor creatures, whom the wonderful providence of God had rescued from the slavery of Algiers, and hoped that he would show mercy to our afflictions. The honest farmer, moved with our relation, sent out bread, water, and olives. After refreshing ourselves with these, we lay down and rested 3 or 4 hours in the field, and having given him thanks for his charity, prepared to crawl away. Pleased with our gratitude, he called us into his house, and gave us good warm bean pottage, which to me seemed the best food I had ever eaten. Again taking leave, we advanced towards Majorca, which was about 10 miles distant. Next morning we arrived in the suburbs, where the singularity of our attire, being barefoot and bare-legged, and having nothing on except loose shirts drawn over our coats, attracted a crowd of inquirers. We gave a circumstantial account of our deliverance, and as they were willing to contribute to our relief, they supplied us with food, wine, strong waters, and whatever else might renovate our exhausted spirits. They said, however, that we must remain in the suburbs until the Viceroy had notice of our arrival. We were called before him, and when he had heard of the account of our escape and dangers, he ordered us to be maintained at his expense until we should obtain a passage to our own country, and, in the meantime, the people collected money to buy clothes and shoes. From Majorca they proceeded to Cadiz, and from thence to England, which they reached in safety. Several expeditions at different periods were fitted out by different European nations to chastise the pirates. The Emperor Charles V, in the plenitude of his power, sailed with a formidable armament in the year 1541, and effected a landing. Without doubt he would have taken the city if a terrible storm had not risen, which destroyed a great part of his fleet and obliged him to re-embark with his shattered forces in the greatest precipitation. The exultation of the Algerines was unbounded. They now looked on themselves as the special favorites of heaven, and the most powerful army which had ever attempted their subjection had returned with the loss of 1/3 their number, and a great part of its ships and transports. Prisoners had been taken in such abundance that to show their worthlessness they were publicly sold in the marketplace at Algiers, at an onion a head. For nearly a century after this, little occurs of note in Algerine history, except a constant system of piracy. In 1655, the British Admiral Blake gave them a drubbing. The French were the next to attack these common enemies of Europe. Admiral Duguesne commanded the expedition, and after bombarding the place a short time, the Dey himself soon began to be terrified at the destruction these new engines of naval war made, when an unfavorable wind arising compelled the fleet to make all sail for Toulon. Relieved from the terror of immediate destruction, the Algerines returned to their old ways, making descents on the coast of Provence, where they committed the most dreadful ravages, killing, burning, and destroying all that came in their way. The Dey also recovered not only his courage, but his humor, for learning what a large sum the late expedition against his city had cost, he sent to say, that if Louis would give him half the money, he would undertake to burn the whole city to please him. The French accordingly sent a new expedition under the same officers the next year. Duguesne again sailed, and in front of the city was joined by Marquis d'Affranville at the head of 5 other stout ships. A council of war was held and an immediate attack resolved upon, in consequence of which, the vessels having taken up their stations, 100 bombs were thrown into the town during that day, and as many more on the following night, when the town was observed to be on fire in several places. The Dey's palace and other public buildings were in ruins. Some of the batteries were dismounted, and several vessels sunk in the fort. The speedy destruction soon determined the Dey and Janissaries to sue for peace, and a message to this effect was sent to Duguesne, who consented to cease firing, but refused to negotiate regarding terms, until all the captives were taken fighting under the French flag were given up as a preliminary step. This was agreed to, and 142 prisoners immediately sent off. In the meantime, the soldiery, becoming furious, assassinated the Dey and elected a new one, who ordered the flag to be hoisted on the city walls. Hostilities were now renewed with greater fury than before, and the French admiral threw such volleys of bombs into the city that in less than 3 days the greatest part of it was reduced to ashes, and the fire burnt with such vehemence that the bay was illuminated to the distance of 2 or 3 leagues. Rendered desperate by the carnage around him, the new Dey ordered all the French captives who had been collected into the city to be cruelly murdered, and binding Father Vacher, the French resident, hand and foot, had him tied to a mortar and fired off like a bomb against the French fleet. This wanton piece of atrocity so exasperated Duguesne that, laying his fleet as near land as possible, he continued his cannonade until he had destroyed all their shipping, fortifications, buildings, in short, almost the whole of the lower town, and about 2/3 of the upper, when, finding nothing else which a naval force could do, and being unprovided for a land expedition, he stood out leisurely at sea, leaving the Algerines to reflect over the sad consequences of their obstinacy. For several years after this they kept in the old piratical track, and upon the British consul's making a complaint to the Dey, on occasion of one of his corsairs having captured a vessel, he openly replied, "It is all very true, but what would you have? The Algerines are a company of rogues, and I am their captain." To such people force was the argument, and in 1700 Captain Beach, falling in with 7 of their frigates, attacked them, drove them on shore, and burnt them. Expeditions at various times were sent against them, but without effecting much, and most of the maritime nations paid them tribute. But a new power was destined to spring up from which these pirates were to receive their first check. That power was the United States of America. In 1792 his corsairs, in a single cruise, swept off 10 American vessels and sent their crews to Bagnio, so that there were 115 in slavery. Negotiations were at once set on foot. The Dey's demands had of course risen in proportion to the number of his prisoners, and the Americans had not only to pay ransom at a high rate, with presents, marine stores, and yearly tribute, but to build and present to the Dey, as a propitiatory offering, a 36-gun frigate, so that the whole expenses fell little short of $1 million, in return for which they obtained liberty for their captives, protection for their merchant vessels, and the right of free trade with the Algiers. The treaty was signed September 15, 1795, and from that time up to 1812 the Dey continued on tolerable good terms with Congress. Indeed, so highly was he pleased with them in 1800 that he signified to the council his intention of sending an ambassador to the port, with the customary presents, in the Washington, a small American frigate, at the time lying in the harbor of Algiers. In vain the consul and captain remonstrated, and represented that they had no authority to send the vessel on such a mission. They were silenced by the assurance that it was a particular honor conferred on them, which the Dey had declined offering to any of the English vessels then in the harbor, as he was rather angry with that nation. The Washington was obliged to be prepared for the service. The corsair flag, bearing the turbaned head of Ally, was run up her main top, under a salute of 7 guns, and in this respectable plight she sailed up the Mediterranean, dropped anchor before the 7 Towers, where, having landed her cargo, she was permitted to resume her own colours, and was thus the first vessel to hoist the American Union in the Thracian Bosphorus. In 1812, however, the Dey, finding his funds at a low ebb, and receiving from all quarters reports that a wealthy American commerce was afloat, determined on trying them with a new war. He was peculiarly unfortunate in the time chosen, as the States, having about a month previously declared war with Great Britain, had, in fact, withdrawn most of the merchant ships from the sea, so that the only prize which fell into the hands of the Dey's cruisers was a small brig, with a crew of 11 persons. The time at length came for putting an end to these lawless depredations, and peace having been concluded with England, President Madison in 1815 dispatched an American squadron under Commodores Bainbridge and Decatur, with Mr. Shaler as envoy, on board to demand full satisfaction for all injuries done to American subjects, the immediate release of such as were captives, the restitution of their property, with an assurance that no future violence should be offered, and also to negotiate the preliminaries of a treaty on terms of perfect equality, no proposal of tribute being at all admissible. The squadron reached its destination early in June, and, having captured an Algerine frigate and brig of war, suddenly appeared before Algiers, at a moment when all the cruisers were at sea, and delivered for the consideration of the Divan the terms on which they were commissioned to make peace, together with a letter from the President to the Dey. Confounded by the sudden and entirely unexpected appearance of this force, the Algerines agreed on the 30th of June to the proposals of a treaty, almost without discussion. It had long been a reproach to Great Britain, the mistress of the sea, that she had tamely suffered a barbarian power to commit such atrocities, ravages on the fleets and shores of the minor states belonging to the Mediterranean. At length a good cause was made for chastising them. At Bonney, a few miles to the east of Algiers, was an establishment for carrying on a coral fishery, under the protection of the British flag, which at the season was frequented by a number of boats from the Corsican, Neapolitan, and other Italian ports. On the 23rd of May, the Feast of Ascension, as the crews of all the boats were preparing to hear Mass, a gun was fired from the castle, and at the same time appeared about 2,000, other accounts to say 4,000, infantry and cavalry, consisting of Turks, Levanters, and Moors. A part of these troops proceeded towards the country, whilst another band advanced towards the river, where the fishing boats were lying at different distances from the sea, and opening a fire upon the unfortunate fishermen, who were partly on board and partly on land, massacred almost the whole of them. They then seized the English flags, tore them in pieces, and trampling them under foot, dragged them along in ground in triumph. The men who happened to be in the country saved themselves by flight, and declared that they saw the soldiers pillage the house of the British vice-consul, the magazines containing the provisions, and the coral that had been fished up. A few boats escaped and brought the news to Genoa, whence it was transmitted by the agent of Lloyd's in a dispatch dated June 6th. No sooner had the account of this atrocious slaughter reached England than all ranks seemed inflamed with the desire that a great and signal punishment should be taken on this barbarian prince, who was neither restrained by the feelings of humanity nor bound by treaties. An expedition, therefore, was fitted out with all speed at Portsmouth, and the command entrusted to Lord Exmouth, who, after some delays from contrary winds, finally sailed July 28th, with a fleet complete in all points, consisting of his own ship, the Queen Charlotte, 120 guns, the impregnable rear admiral Sir David Milne, 90 guns, Minden, Superb, Albion, each 74 guns, the Leander 50 guns, with more frigates and brigs, bombs, fireships, and several smaller vessels well supplied, in addition to the ordinary means of warfare, with Congreve rockets and shrapnel shells, the destructive powers of which have lately been abundantly proved on the continent. August 9th, the fleet anchored at Gibraltar, and was there joined by the Dutch Admiral Van Capellen, commanding 5 frigates and a corvette, who had been already at Algiers, endeavoring to deliver slaves, but being refused, and finding his force insufficient, had determined on joining himself with the English squadron, which it was understood was under way. Meanwhile, the Prometheus, Captain Dashwood, had been sent forward to Algiers to bring off the British consul and family, but could only succeed in getting his wife and daughter, who were obliged to make their escape disguised in midshipman's uniform, for the Dey, having heard through some French papers of the British expedition, had seized the consul, Mr. Macdonell, and put him in chains, and hearing of the escape of his wife, immediately ordered the detention of 2 boats of the Prometheus, which happened to be on shore, and made slaves of the crews, amounting to 18 men. This new outrage was reported to Lord Exmouth soon after leaving Gibraltar, and of course added not a little to his eagerness to reach Algiers. He arrived off Algiers on the morning of the 27th of August, and sent in his interpreter, Mr. Salame, with Lieutenant Burgess, under a flag of truce, bearing a letter for the Dey, demanding reparation. Meantime, a light breeze sprung up, and the fleet advanced into the bay and lay to, at about a mile off Algiers. It was now, says Mr. Salame, in his entertaining narrative, 2:30, and no answer coming out, notwithstanding we had stayed half an hour longer than our instructions, and the fleet being almost opposite the town, with the fine breeze, we thought proper, after having done our duty, to lose no more time, but to go on board and inform his lordship of what had happened. Mr. Burgess, the flag lieutenant, having agreed with me, we hoisted the signal that no answer had been given, and began to row away towards the Queen Charlotte. After I had given a report to the Admiral of our meeting, the captain of the port, and our waiting there, etc., I was quite surprised to see how his lordship was altered from what I left him in the morning. for I knew his manner was in general very mild, and now he seemed to me all fightful as a fierce lion, which had been chained in its cage, and was set now at liberty. With all that, his lordship's answer to me was, "Never mind, we shall see now," and at the same time he turned towards the officers, saying, "Be ready," whereupon I saw every one with the match or the string of the lock in his hand, most anxiously expecting the word "Fire!" No sooner had Salome returned than his lordship made the signal to know whether all the ships were ready, which being answered in the affirmative, he directly turned the head of the Queen Charlotte towards the shore, and to the utter amazement of the Algerines ran across all the batteries without firing or receiving a single shot, until he brought up within 80 yards of the south end of the mole, where he lashed her to the mainmast of an Algerine brig, which he had taken as his direction, and had then the pleasure of seeing all the rest of the fleet, including the Dutch frigates, taking up their assigned stations with the same precision and regularity. The position in which the Charlotte was laid was so admirable that she was only exposed to the fire of 3 or 4 flanking guns, while her broadside swept the whole batteries, and completely commanded the mole and marine, every part of which could be seen distinctly from her quarter-deck. Up to this moment not a shot had been fired, and the batteries were all crowded with spectators, gazing in astonishment at the quiet and regularity which prevailed through all the British ships, and the dangerous vicinity in which they placed themselves to such formidable means of defence. Lord Exmouth, therefore, began to conceive hopes that his demands would still be granted, but the delay, it appeared, was caused by the Algerines being completely unprepared for so very sudden an approach, insomuch that their guns were not shotted at the moment when the Queen Charlotte swept past them, and they were distinctly seen loading them as the other ships were coming into line. Anxious, if possible, to spare unnecessary effusion of blood, his lordship, standing on the quarter-deck, repeatedly waved his hat as a warning to the multitudes assembled on the mole to retire, but his signal was unheeded, and at 3:15 in the afternoon the first gun was fired at the Queen Charlotte from the eastern battery, and 2 more at the Albion and Superb, which were following. Then Lord Exmouth, having seen only the smoke of the gun before the sound reached him, said with great alacrity, "That will do. Fire, my fine fellows!" And I am sure that before his lordship had finished these words, our broadside was given with great cheering, which was fired 3 times within 5 or 6 minutes, and at the same time the other ships did the same. This first fire was so terrible that they say more than 500 persons were killed and wounded by it, and I believe this, because there was a great crowd of people in every part, many of whom after the first discharge I saw running away, under the walls like dogs, walking upon their feet and hands. After the attack took place on both sides in this horrible manner, immediately the sky was darkened by the smoke, the sun completely eclipsed, and the horizon became dreary. Being exhausted by the heat of that powerful sun to which I was exposed the whole day, and my ears being deafened by the roar of the guns, and finding myself in the dreadful danger of such a terrible engagement, in which I had never been before, I was quite at a loss, and like an astonished or stupid man, and did not know myself where I was. At last his lordship, having perceived my situation, said, "You have done your duty, now go below." Upon which I began to descend from the quarter-deck, quite confounded and terrified, and not sure that I should reach the cockpit alive. For it was most tremendous to hear the crashing of the shot, to see the wounded men brought from one part, and the killed from the other, and especially at such a time to be found among the English seamen, and to witness their manners, their activity, their courage, and their cheerfulness during the battle. It is really most overpowering, and beyond imagination. The battle continued to rage furiously, and the havoc on both sides was very great. There were some awful moments, particularly when Algerine vessels so near our line were set on fire. The officers surrounding Lord Exmouth had been anxious for permission to make an attempt upon the outer frigate, distant about 100 yards. He at length consented, and Major Gossett of the Corps of Marines eagerly entreated and obtained permission to accompany Lieutenant Richards in the ship's barge. The frigate was instantly boarded, and, in 10 minutes, in a perfect blaze. A gallant young midshipman, although forbidden, was led by his too ardent spirit to follow in support of the barge, in which attempt he was desperately wounded, his brother officer killed, and 9 of the crew. The barge, by rowing more rapidly, escaped better, having but 1 killed. About sunset the Admiral received a message from Rear Admiral Milne, stating his severe loss in killed and wounded, amounting to 150, and requesting that, if possible, a frigate might be sent him to take off some of the enemy's fire. The Glasgow accordingly was ordered to get under way, but the wind having been laid by the cannonade, she was obliged again to anchor, having obtained a rather more favourable position. The flotilla of mortar, gun, and rocket boats, under the direction of their respective artillery officers, shared to the full extent of their powers the honours and toils of this glorious day. It was by their fire that all the ships in the port, with the exception of the outer frigate already mentioned, were in flames, which, extending rapidly over the whole arsenal, gunboats, and storehouses, exhibited a spectacle of awful grandeur and interest which no pen can describe. The sloops of war which had been appropriated to aid and assist the ships of the line and prepare for their retreat, performed not only that duty well, but embraced every opportunity of firing through the intervals, and were constantly in motion. The shells from the bombs were admirably well thrown by the Royal Marine Artillery, and though directed over and across our own men of war, did not produce a single accident. To complete the confusion of the enemy, the admiral now ordered the explosion ship, which had been charged for the occasion, to be brought within the mole. But upon the representation of Sir David Milne that it would do him essential service if made to act on the battery in his front, it was towed to that spot and blown up with tremendous effect. This was almost the final blow. The enemy's fire had for some time been very slack, and now almost wholly ceased, except that occasionally a few shots and shells were discharged from the higher citadel, upon which the guns of the fleet could not be brought to bear. The admiral, who from the commencement had been in the hottest of the engagement, and had fired until his guns were so hot that they could, some of them, not be used again, now seeing that he had executed the most important part of his instructions, issued orders for drawing off the fleet. This was commenced in excellent order about 10 at night, and the usual breeze having set off from shore favored their maneuver, so that, all hands being employed in warping and towing, the vessels were got safely into the bay, and anchored beyond reach of shot about 2 o'clock the next morning. So signal and well contested a victory could not have been gained without a considerable loss and suffering. It amounted in the English fleet to 128 men killed and 690 wounded, and the Dutch squadron to 13 killed and 52 wounded. Grand total 883. But the enemy suffered much more severely. They are computed to have lost, in killed and wounded, not less than between 6,000 and 7,000 men. The loss sustained by the Algerines by the destruction in the mole was 4 large frigates of 44 guns, 5 large corvettes from 24 to 30 guns. All the gun and mortar boats, except 7, 30 destroyed. Several merchant brigs and schooners, a great number of small vessels of various descriptions, all the pontoons, lighters, and etc., storehouses and arsenal with all the timber and various marine articles destroyed in part, a great many gun carriages, mortar beds, casks, and ship stores of all descriptions. Negotiations were immediately opened in form, and on the 30th August the admiral published a notification to the fleet that all demands had been complied with. The British consul had been indemnified for his losses, and the Dey, in presence of all his officers, had made him a public apology for the insults offered him. On the 1st of September, Lord Exmouth had the pleasure of informing the Secretary of the Admiralty that all the slaves in the city of Algiers and its immediate vicinity were embarked, as also $357,000 for Naples and $25,000 for Sardinia. The number of slaves thus released amounted to 1,083, of whom 471 were Neapolitans, 236 Sicilians, 173 Romans, 6 Tuscans, 161 Spaniards, 1 Portuguese, 7 Greeks, 28 Dutch, and not 1 Englishman. Were there an action more than another on which an Englishman would willingly risk the fame and honor of his nation, it would be this attack on Algiers, which, undertaken solely at her own risk, and earned solely by the expenditure of her own blood and her own resources, rescued not a single subject of her own from the tyrant's grasp, while it freed more than 1,000 belonging to other European powers. In August 1816, the strength of Algiers seemed annihilated. Her walls were in ruins, her haughty flag was humbled to the dust, her gates lay open to a hostile power, and terms were dictated in the palace of her princes. A year passed, the hostile squadron had left her ports, the clang of the workman's hammer, the hum of busy men resounded through her streets, fresh walls had risen, new and more formidable batteries had been added. Again she resumed her attitude as of yore, bid defiance to her foes, and declared war on civilization. Again her blood-stained corsairs swept the seas, eager for plunder, ready for combat. Christian commerce once more became shackled by her enterprise, and Christian captives once more sent up their cry for deliverance. In 1819 her piracies had become so numerous that the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle caused it to be notified to the Dey that their cessation was required, and would be enforced by a combined French and English squadron. His reply was brief but arrogant, and the admirals were obliged to leave without obtaining the least satisfaction. By menaces, however, accompanied by the presence of some cruisers, England, France, and the United States caused their flags to be respected. Ali, the successor of Amar, had died in 1818, and was succeeded by Hussein Pasha, who, from the commencement of his reign, evinced the strongest antipathy to the French power. In 1824 he imposed an arbitrary tax through all his provinces on French goods and manufactures. The consul's house was frequently entered and searched in a vexatious manner, contrary to the express stipulation of the treaties. And finally, April 1827, the consul himself, having gone at the feast of Bairam to pay his respects, was, upon a slight difference of opinion arising during their conversation, struck across the mouth with a fly-flap which the Dey held in his hand, and in consequence soon after left Algiers, while the Dey ordered the destruction of all the French establishments along the coast towards Bonney, and oppressed in every manner the French residents within his dominions. A blockade was instantly commenced by the French, and maintained for nearly 3 years, until it was found that they suffered much more by it than the Dey, the expense having reached nearly 800,000 sterling, while he appeared no way inconvenienced by their efforts, and even treated them with such contempt as to order his forts to fire on the vessel of Admiral Le da Brontignier, who in 1829 had gone there under a flag of truce to make a final proposal of terms of accommodation. So signal a violation of the laws of nations could not be overlooked, even by the imbecile administrations of Charles X. All France was in an uproar. The national flag had been dishonored, and her ambassador insulted. The cry for war became loud and universal. Conferences on the subject were held. The oldest and most experienced mariners were invited by the minister at war to assist in his deliberations, and an expedition was finally determined on in the month of February 1830, to consist of about 37,000 men, a number which it was calculated would not only be sufficient to overcome all opposition which might be encountered, but to enable the French to reduce the kingdom to a province, and retain it in subjection for any length of time that might be considered advisable. No sooner was this decision promulgated than all the necessary preparations were commenced with the utmost diligence. It was now February, and the expedition was to embark by the end of April, so that no time could be lost. The arsenals, the navy, and military workships were all in full employment. Field and breaching batteries were mounted on a new principle lately adopted. Gabions, earth-bag, chevaux de frise, and projectiles were made in the greatest abundance. Maps, notes, and all the information that could be procured respecting Barbary were transmitted to the War Office, where their contents were compared and digested, and a plan of operations was drawn out. The commissariat were busy collecting provisions, wagons, and fitting out an efficient hospital train. A deputy commissary was dispatched to reconnoitre the coasts of Spain and the Balearic Islands, to ascertain what resources could be drawn from them, and negotiate with the king for leave to establish military hospitals at Port Mahon. 18 regiments of the line, 3 squadrons of cavalry, and different corps of artillery and engineers were ordered to hold themselves in readiness. 400 transports were assembled and chartered by government in the port of Marseille, while the vessels of war, which were to form the convoy, were appointed their rendezvous in the neighborhood of Toulon. After some hesitation as to who should command this important expedition, the Count de Bourmont, then minister at war, thought fit to appoint himself, and his état-major was soon complete, Desprez acting as chief, and Tholoze as second in command. Maubert de Neuilly was chosen provost-marshal, de Bartillat, who afterwards wrote an entertaining account of the expedition, quartermaster-general, and de Carnay commissary-general to the forces. In addition to these, there were about 20 aides-de-camp, orderlies, and young men of rank attached to the staff, together with a Spanish general, an English colonel, a Russian colonel and lieutenant, and 2 Saxon officers, deputed by their respective governments. There was also a section of engineer geographers whose business was to survey and map the country as it was conquered, and, says M. Roget, who was himself employed in the service we have just mentioned, and to whose excellent work, written in that capacity, we are so much indebted, 24 interpreters, the half of whom knew neither French nor Arabic, were attached to the different corps of the army, in order to facilitate their intercourse with the inhabitants. As the minister had determined on risking his own reputation on the expedition, the supplies were all, of course, of the completest kind, and in the greatest abundance. Provisions for 3 months were ordered. An equal quantity was to be forwarded as soon as the army had landed in Africa, and amongst the other materials furnished we observe, in looking over the returns, 30 wooden legs and 200 crutches, for the relief of the unfortunate heroes, a boring apparatus to sink pumps if water should run short, and a balloon, with 2 aeronauts, to reconnoitre the enemy's position, in case, as was represented to be their wont, they should entrench themselves under the shelter of hedges and brushwood. The French effected a landing at Sidi el Farouk, a small promontory about 5 leagues to the west of Algiers, and half a league to the east of the river Massafloran, where it discharges itself into the bay. On the 14th of June they all landed without opposition. After a continued series of engagement and skirmishes, the army got within cannon shot of Algiers, where they broke ground and began entrenching, and the French works being completed, the heavy breaching cannon were all mounted, and at daybreak on the 4th of July, General Lahitte, having assured himself by personal inspection that all was ready, ordered the signal rocket to be thrown, and at the same moment the whole French batteries opened their fire within point-blank distance, and with a report which shook the whole of Algiers and brought the garrison, who were little expecting so speedy an attack, running to their posts. The artillery was admirably served, and from one battery which enfiladed the fort, the balls were seen to sweep away at once an entire row of Algerine cannoneers from their guns. The Turks displayed the most undaunted courage. They answered shot for shot, supplied with fresh men in the places of such as were slain, stopped up with wool sacks the breaches made by the balls, replaced the cannon which the French fire had dismounted, and never relaxed their exertions for a moment. But the nature of their works was ill calculated to withstand the scientific accuracy with which the besiegers made their attack. Every ball now told, the tower in the center was completely riddled by shots and shells. The bursting of these latter had disabled great numbers of the garrison. By 7 o'clock the besieged had begun to retire from the most damaged part of their works. By 8:30 the whole outer line of defense was abandoned, and by 9 the fire of the fort was extinct. The Turkish general, finding opposition hopeless, had sent to the Dey for commands, and in reply was ordered to retreat with his whole remaining force to Casaba, and leave 3 negroes to blow up the fort. The tranquillity with which they performed the fatal task deserves record. The French, finding the enemy's fire to fail, directed all theirs toward effecting a practicable breach. The fort seemed to be abandoned. 2 red flags floated still on its outside line of defense, and a third on the angle towards the city. 3 negroes were seen calmly walking on the ramparts, and from time to time looking over, as if to examine what the progress the breach was making. One of them, struck by a cannon ball, fell, and the others, as if to revenge his death, ran to a cannon, pointed it, and fired 3 shots. At the third the gun turned over, and they were unable to replace it. They tried another, and as they were in the act of raising it, a shot swept the legs from under one of them. The remaining negro gazed for a moment at his comrade, drew him a little back, left him, and once more examined the breach. He then snatched one of the flags and retired to the interior of the tower. In a few minutes he reappeared, took a second, and descended. The French continued to cannonade, and the breach appeared almost practicable, when suddenly they were astounded by a terrific explosion, which shook the whole ground as with an earthquake. An immense column of smoke, mixed with streaks of flame, burst from the center of the fortress. Masses of solid masonry were hurled into the air to an amazing height, while cannon, stones, timbers, projectiles, and dead bodies were scattered in every direction. The negro had done his duty. The fort was blown up. In half an hour the French sappers and miners were at work repairing the smoking ruins. Their advanced guards had effected a reconnaissance along the side of the hill towards the fort Babazuna, and their engineers had broken ground for new works within 700 yards of the Casaba. But these preparations were unnecessary. The Dey had resigned all further intention of resistance, and at 2 o'clock a flag of truce was announced, which proved to be Sidi Mustapha, the Dey's private secretary, charged with offers of paying the whole expense of the campaign, relinquishing all his demands on France, and making any further reparation that the French general might require, on condition that the troops should not enter Algiers. These proposals met with an instant negative. Bourmont felt that Algiers was in his power, and declared that he would grant no other terms than an assurance of life to the Dey and inhabitants, adding that if the gates were not opened he should recommence his fire. Scarcely had Mustapha gone than 2 other deputies appeared, sent by the townsmen to plead in their behalf. They were a Turk called Omar, and a Moor named Baudebra, and who, having lived for some time at Marseilles, spoke French perfectly. They received nearly the same answer as Mustapha, but they proved themselves better diplomatists, for they spoke so much to the general of the danger there would be in refusing the Janissaries all terms, and the probability that if thus driven to despair they might make a murderous resistance, and afterwards destroy all the wealth and blow up all the forts before surrendering, that Bourmont, yielding to their representations, became less stern in his demands, and Mustapha, having returned about the same time with the English vice-consul as a mediator, the following terms were finally committed to paper, and sent to the Dey by an interpreter. 1. The fort of the Casaba, with all the other forts dependent on Algiers and the harbor, shall be placed in the hands of the French troops the 5th of July at 10 o'clock a.m. 2. The General-in-Chief of the French army ensures the Dey of Algiers personal liberty and all his private property. 3. The Dey shall be free to retire with his family and wealth wherever he pleases. While he remains at Algiers, he and his family shall be under the protection of the Commander-in-Chief. A guard shall ensure his safety and that of his family. 4. The same advantages and same protection are assured to all the soldiers of the militia. 5. The exercise of the Mohammedan religion shall remain free. The liberty of the inhabitants of all classes, their religion, property, commerce, and industry shall receive no injury. Their women shall be respected. The general takes this on his own responsibility. 6. The ratification of this convention to be made before 10 a.m. on the 5th of July, and the French troops immediately after to take possession of the Casaba and other forts. These terms were so much more favorable than the Dey could have expected that, of course, not a moment was lost in signifying his acceptance. He only begged to be allowed 2 hours more to get himself and his goods out of the Casaba, and these were readily granted. It may indeed be wondered at that he and his janissaries should be allowed to retain their ill-gotten booty under the name of private property, but Count de Bourmont, though not without talent, was essentially a weak man, and was in this instance overreached by the wily Moor. The whole of next morning an immense number of persons were seen flying from Algiers, previous to the entry of the French army, and carrying with them all their goods, valuables, and money. They fled by the fort Babazuna on the roads towards Constantina and Blida, and about 100 mounted Arabs were seen caracoling on the beach, as if to cover their retreat. No opposition to it, however, was made by the French troops, or by their navy, which had now again come into sight. At 12 o'clock the general, with his staff, artillery, and a strong guard, entered the Casaba, and at that same moment all the other forts were taken possession of by French troops. No one appeared to make a formal surrender, nor did anyone present himself on the part of the inhabitants to inquire as to what protection they were to receive. Yet, on the whole, we believe the troops conducted themselves, at least on this occasion, with signal forbearance, and that of the robberies which took place, the greater number were perpetrated by Moors and Jews. One was rather ingenious. The Minister of Finance had given up the public treasures to commissioners regularly appointed for the purpose. Amongst others, the mint was visited, a receipt given of its containing bullion to the amount of 25,000 or 30,000 francs, the door sealed, and a sentry placed. Next morning the seal was perfect, the sentry at his post, but the bullion had gone through a small hole made in the back wall. The amount of public property found in Algiers and appropriated by the French was very considerable, and much more than repaid the expenses of the expedition. The blockade of the last 3 years had, by interrupting their commerce, caused an accumulation of the commodities in which the Algerines generally paid their tribute, so that the storehouses at the Casaba were abundantly filled with wool, hides, leather, wax, lead, and copper. Quantities of grains, silks, muslins, and gold and silver tissues were also found, as well as salt, of which the Dey had reserved to himself a monopoly, and by buying it very cheap at the Balearic Isles, used to sell it at an extravagant rate to his subjects. The treasure alone amounted to nearly 50 millions of francs, and the cannon, projectiles, powder magazines, and military stores, together with the public buildings, foundries, dockyards, and vessels in the harbor, were estimated at a still larger amount, while the entire expense of the expedition, including land and sea service, together with the maintenance of an army of occupation of up to January 1831, was computed not to exceed 48,500,000 francs, so that France must have realized, by her first connection with Algiers, a sum not far short of 3 millions sterling, a larger amount, we will venture to say, than is likely to accrue to her again, even after many years of colonization. In a few days the Dey had embarked for Naples, which he chose as his future place of residence. The Janissaries were sent in French vessels to Constantinople. The Bey of Tipperary made his submissions and swore allegiance to the French king. Orders were issued and laws enacted in his name. The Arabs and Kailis came into market as usual with their fowl and game. A French soldier was tolerably safe as long as he avoided going to any distance beyond the outposts, and, on the whole, Algiers the warlike had assumed all the appearance of a French colony. End of chapter 27. Recording by Laura Christ, Louisville, Kentucky.
Chapter 28 of the Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ben Wilford. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles ELLMS, Chapter 28. The Adventures, Trial, and Execution of Captain Gal. Captain Gal sailed from Amsterdam in July 1724 on board the George, galley for Santa Cruz, where they took in beeswax. Scarcely had they sailed from the place when Gal and several others, who had formed a conspiracy, seized the vessel. One of the conspirators cried, "There's a man overboard!" The captain instantly ran to the side of the vessel, when he was seized by 2 men, who attempted to throw him over. He, however, so struggled that he escaped from their hands. One winter, with a knife, attempted to cut him in the throat, but missing his aim, the captain was yet saved. but Gal, coming aft, shot him through the body, and throwing him over the rail, he caught hold of the main sheet. But Gal, taking up an axe, with 2 blows, so disabled him that he fell into the sea and was drowned. The conspirators proceeded to murder all who were not in their horrid plot, which being done, James Williams came upon deck, and striking one of the guns with his cutlass, saluted Gal in the following words: "Captain Gal, you are welcome. Welcome to your command." Williams was declared lieutenant, and the other officers being appointed, the captain addressed them, saying, "If hereafter I see any of you whispering together, or if any of you refuse to obey my orders, let every such man depend upon it, that he shall certainly go the same way as those that are just gone before." Their first prize was the Sarah Snow of Bristol. After they had rifled the vessel and received 1 man from it, they allowed her to prosecute her voyage. The Delight of Poole was the next vessel that fell into their hands, but they not long after captured 2 others, from one of which they received a quantity of fish, and from the other bread, beef, and pork. They also forced 2 men from the latter ship. A French ship, not long after, furnished them with wine, oil, figs, oranges, and lemons, to the value of 500 pounds. In a short time after, they captured their last prize, and as she made no resistance, they plundered and dismissed her. They next sailed for the Orkney Isles to clean, but were apprehended by a gentleman of that country, brought up to London, and tried before a court of admiralty in May 1725. When their first indictment was read, Gal obstinately refused to plead, for which the court ordered his thumbs to be tied together with whipcord. The punishment was several times repeated by the executioner and another officer, they drawing the cord every time till it broke; but he still being stubborn, refusing to submit to the court, the sentence was pronounced against him, which the law appoints in such cases, that is, that he should be taken back to prison, and there pressed to death. The jailer was then ordered to conduct him back, and see that the sentence was executed the next morning. Meanwhile the trials of the prisoners, his companions, went forward. But the next morning, when the press was prepared, pursuant to the order of the court the day before, he was so terrified with the apprehension of dying in that manner, that he sent his humble petition to the court, praying that he might be admitted to plead. This request being granted, he was brought again to the bar, and arraigned upon the first indictment, to which he pleaded "not guilty." Then the depositions that had been given against the other prisoners were repeated, upon which he was convicted, and received the sentence of death accordingly, which he suffered in company with Captain Weaver and William Ingham. The stories of these 2 men are so interwoven with others, that it will be impossible to distinguish many of their particular actions. They were, however, proved to have been concerned, if not the principal actors, in the following piracies. First, the seizing a Dutch ship in August, 1722, and taking from thence 100 pieces of Holland, value 800 pounds, 1,000 pieces of 8, value 250 pounds. Secondly, the entering and pillaging the Dolphin of London, William Haddock, out of which they got 300 pieces of 8, value 75 pounds. 40 gallons of rum, and other things on the 20th of November in the same year. Thirdly, the stealing out of the ship called the Don Carlos, Lot Netkin's master, 400 ounces of silver, value 100 pounds, 50 gallons of rum, value 30 shillings, 1,000 pieces of 8, 100 pistolas, and other valuable goods; and fourthly, the taking from a ship called the England 10 pipes of wine, value 250 pounds. The 2 last charges, both in the year 1721, Weaver returned home and came to Mr. Thomas Smith at Bristol in a very ragged condition, and pretending that he had been robbed by pirates, Smith, who had been acquainted with him 8 or 9 years before, provided him with necessaries, and he walked about unmolested for some time. But Captain Joseph Smith, who knew him when a pirate, one day met him, and asked him to go and take a bottle with him. When they were in the tavern, he told him that he had been a considerable sufferer by his boarding his vessel. "Therefore," said he, "as I understand that you are in good circumstances, I expect that you will make me some restitution, which if you do, I will never hurt a hair on your head, because you were very civil to me when I was in your hands. But as this recompense were never given, Weaver is apprehended and executed." End of chapter 28. Recording by Ben Wilford.
Chapter 29 of The Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles ELLMS. Chapter 29. Pirate's Song. To the mast nail our flag, it is dark as the grave, or the death which it bears while it sweeps o'er the wave. Let our deck clear for action, our guns be prepared, be the boarding-axe sharpened, the scimitar bared. Set the canisters ready, and then bring to me, for the last of my duties, the powder-room key. It shall never be lowered, the black flag we bear. If the sea be denied us, we sweep through the air. Unshared have we left our last victory's prey. It is mine to divide it, and yours to obey. There are shawls that might suit a sultana's white neck, and pearls that are fair as the arms they will deck. There are flasks which, unseal them, the air will disclose Diametta's fair summers, the home of the rose. I claim not a portion, I ask but as mine 'tis to drink to our victory 1 cup of red wine. Some fight, 'tis for riches, some fight, 'tis for fame. The first I despise, and the last is a name. I fight, 'tis for vengeance. I love to see flow at the stroke of my sabre the life of my foe. I strike for the memory of long-vanished years. I only shed blood where another shed tears. I come as the lightning comes red from above o'er the race that I loathe, to the battle I love. Finis. End of chapter 29. Read by Kara Schallenberg on October 8th, 2008. And the end of The Pirate's Own Book by Charles ELLMS.